He was 5 years old when the Jedi took him, not stolen, not ripped from screaming arms. His parents gave him away freely, proud, trembling, believing the stories they'd heard since they were children, that the Jedi would raise him in peace, that the Force had chosen him for something greater, that the temple was a sacred place where children became protectors of the galaxy. They were wrong. The boy didn't remember their faces, only a hand. A pale hand on his shoulder as he stepped into the grand halls of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, his future carved out by a test he couldn't understand. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He was quiet. Too quiet, even for the Jedi. The other younglings played and trained, slept in rows, and laughed in the presence of their masters. But this boy, he watched. He listened. His teachers said he learned quickly, but there was something in his stillness that made the older Jedi pause. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He never lost his temper. He never raised his voice. But when he looked at you, it felt like he was measuring you. From behind those dark eyes, something was already calculating, studying weakness like it was part of his training. He should have been noticed sooner. He should have been helped. But the Jedi were stretched thin. War was rising on distant worlds. Politics filled the chambers more than meditation did. And in the middle of it all, one man watched the boy from afar, not with pity, not with hope, with interest. His name was never recorded. Not a Padawan, not a knight, not even a failure. He simply vanished. One day, he was present. The next, his room was empty. No trace, no questions asked, and no one remembered seeing him leave. But someone did. In the lower levels of Coruscant, far below the temple walls, a speeder moved in silence through clouds of neon smoke and vertical traffic. In the back seat, beneath a long cloak, the child sat beside a man whose voice didn't comfort, but commanded. "You've seen the Jedi," the man said softly. "That man was Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, but in truth, he was Darth Sidious, the Dark Lord of the Sith, and he had found something the Jedi had overlooked. A boy with no attachments, no empathy, no fear of power. A boy born not to serve, but to infiltrate." The training would begin immediately, not with lightsabers, not with the Force, but with words. Sidious did not scream. He did not strike. He whispered. He showed the boy the galaxy as it truly was, not as the Jedi pretended it to be. He spoke of hypocrisy, of weakness, of how the Jedi let planets burn in the name of peace. The boy listened. He always listened. He didn't know it yet, but he would never return to the temple. He would never be a Jedi. The child who once walked beneath golden spires and statues of heroes was now buried, beneath layers of secrecy, fear, and manipulation. His name would fade. His records would be lost. But the boy survived and became something else. A shadow, hidden beneath the robes of the Republic. And one day, he would return to the Jedi, not as a child, but as their enemy. The boy never asked for a name. He was told that names made people soft, that identity created attachment. Instead, he was given roles: observer, listener, student, not of the Force, not of the Jedi, but of deception. His first lessons took place in the underground chambers beneath the Federal District. In the echoing halls where red columns rose like silent judges, Darth Sidious introduced him to the dark machinery of the Republic, not its armies, its intelligence. He watched senators lie to each other with smiles. He listened to aides whisper threats behind closed doors. He read documents filled with elegant signatures that led to planetary starvation. Every day, he learned the truth. That power did not live in light or dark, but in silence. And he was learning to live there. Sidious called him Malorum, a word from the old tongue. It meant rot, decay, corruption. The boy didn't flinch. He accepted it. Because in his heart, he had already begun to rot. He was placed inside the Republican Intelligence Service, not as an officer, as a shadow, a child among adults, invisible, unnoticed, too quiet to be questioned. He listened as senators were blackmailed. He studied the files of Jedi who disagreed with the Council. He memorized troop movements, communication delays, and the precise timing of assassinations that were never reported. He didn't act. Not yet. His job was to learn. He became the eye that no one saw. One day, he watched a Jedi die. Not in battle, in a corridor, alone. A data pad had been tampered with. The explosion was small, clean, hidden inside a transmission spike. When the smoke cleared, the only person who remained was a technician, too young to be noticed, too ordinary to be suspected. Malorum. He said nothing. He simply recorded the reaction times of the guards, the error margins in the investigation, the inconsistencies in the temple's response, and he filed it all away. Sidious said he was proud, but Malorum didn't feel pride. He felt clarity. The Jedi were vulnerable. The Order believed in vision, prophecy, and purpose, but they couldn't even see a child hiding in their walls. They couldn't see that their temple was already infected. He began to understand something terrible. He had never belonged to the Jedi, not really. They raised him to obey. Sidious taught him to watch. Now he began to see everyone as potential prey. He watched Sly Moore speak in half-sentences. He watched Mas Amedda tighten his fists whenever someone questioned the Chancellor. He saw the Inquisitors begin to take shape long before they had names or codes. He recorded everything, and behind the secrecy, he began to smile. Not with joy, but with power. He was no longer a child, no longer someone learning how to belong. He belonged nowhere. He walked through Senate halls and temple corridors with the same face, the same silence, the same eyes. But inside, he was changing. The mask was forming, and behind it, the Sith were growing. He never spoke unless the words mattered. That was one of the first things Sidious taught him. Every sentence must serve a purpose. Every pause must create doubt. Every silence must leave someone unsure of what you know. And Malorum learned fast. He began studying interrogation reports, not just the answers, but the ways people broke, the timing of fear, the silence between questions. He watched how lies folded under stillness, how even the innocent became confused when faced with a calm stare. He practiced on lower officers. He asked them small things, logistics numbers, deployment logs, trade routes. He never threatened. He simply waited, smiled, watched. Eventually they talked, sometimes without knowing why. He was still only a teenager, and already fear was following him. The Jedi didn't notice. Not truly. They assumed the Republic's shadows were necessary. They trusted too easily. Or perhaps they were too proud to imagine they could be infiltrated from within. Malorum began documenting their blind spots, not with hate, with precision. He knew the Order's routines, their scheduling codes, their ceremonial guards, their over-reliance on meditation and intuition, their refusal to question internal peace. He understood them, and so he understood how they would fall. Sidious never gave praise without purpose, but sometimes when Malorum delivered a file or a secret or a silence that served the plan, the Sith Lord would pause and nod, a gesture so small, so controlled, that it carried more weight than any medal. That was enough. Malorum's identity grew not from recognition, but from usefulness. He didn't want to be loved or remembered. He wanted to be needed. He learned chemical extraction, interrogation, resistance, sleep deprivation techniques. But he also learned subtler things. How to fake a transmission delay, how to mirror someone's speech pattern, how to make a lie look like hesitation. He didn't kill often, but when he did, it was clean. No blood, no mess, no panic. Just one less problem in the galaxy. He studied the Jedi Code late at night, alone, in secret. Not to believe it, to understand what it failed to protect. He read about forbidden attachments and wondered why they called them dangerous, but never admitted how necessary they were. He read about peace, but saw how many wars the Jedi had fought. He read about serenity and remembered the way Master Windu's voice always carried a warning, even when he spoke kindly. And slowly, he began to hate them, not because they were cruel, but because they were blind. He watched the temple increase its surveillance and laughed quietly, knowing it was already too late. Every lesson became a weapon, and he stored them all, not in files, in memory. He knew that datapads could be taken, transmissions could be traced, but a man who lived with secrets inside him, that man could never be destroyed by force, only by doubt. And Malorum had no doubt. He was a child, raised by whispers, a shadow cast by another shadow, a weapon that smiled when others slept. He did not question his place, because he no longer believed in questions, only answers, only control. It was quiet when he returned to the temple, not physically. Shuttles landed. Jedi moved through the halls. The air hummed with life. But something in him was silent. He walked among them wearing a uniform of the Republic, just another aide, another observer. His clearance was temporary. His presence explained. No one looked twice. They should have. He stood beneath the statues of ancient Jedi, masters who had tamed war, led armies, and fallen with honor. He looked up at their faces and felt nothing. They had stood for something, and they had lost everything. He entered the library, the heart of their knowledge, the place he had once been taught to revere. Now he studied the gaps, the missing records, the redacted names, the arrogance of those who believed they could shape truth through omission. He found erased missions, forgotten apprentices, hidden failures. The Jedi kept more secrets than the Sith. He listened to masters speak of peace while they sent Padawans to war. He watched as children trained with blades, told they were defenders, even as the Republic turned darker with each passing month. No one saw the contradiction. No one looked in the mirror. Except him. He passed his old dormitory, the same corridor, the same doors. His old room was occupied now, A younger boy slept in his bed, dreaming of knighthood. He didn't knock. He just stood there. For a moment, he remembered what it felt like to hope, to believe that the Jedi were everything they claimed to be. But hope had no place in his life anymore. He turned away. He walked past the council chambers, the same circle of seats, the same quiet authority. He imagined them looking at him again, searching for fear, for darkness. They would see nothing, because they never did. They hadn't seen it in Dooku. They didn't see it in Anakin, and they would never see it in him. They didn't see what was coming, not because they were blind, because they refused to look down. He left the temple without being stopped, just like he had all those years ago. No one remembered his face. No one questioned his name. He was a shadow that passed through their walls, unnoticed, unchallenged. And when he returned to the lower levels, Sidious was waiting. He asked no questions. He didn't need to. Malorum had seen what he needed to see. The Jedi were not invincible. They were hollow. Their light was failing. He understood now that the war wouldn't be won with armies. It would be won with silence, with infiltration, with truths hidden behind soft voices and patient eyes. He had walked among them again, and they hadn't even flinched. The child they trained was gone. In his place stood a man who believed in nothing but control. He didn't need recognition. He didn't want revenge. He wanted them to vanish, quietly, completely, like they had never existed. He had become what Sidious intended. A wound hidden inside the body of the Republic, a Sith without armor, without scars. The kind of enemy the Jedi were never prepared to fight. The kind who smiled while the galaxy burned, and no one even knew he was there. There are men who control armies, and then there are men who control information. Malorum never asked for a lightsaber. He didn't need one. He understood the galaxy would not be ruled by warriors, but by whispers, by paper trails, by signatures, by the slow erosion of truth written in sealed reports. He learned early that the sharpest blade in the Empire wasn't forged. It was filed. Inside the Republic's Intelligence Bureau, he was assigned to administrative oversight. An invisible seat. One meant to observe, but not influence. The kind of position no one questioned, because it didn't seem important. But that was the trap. No one watched the man behind the datapads. No one feared the one who asked questions with a smile. At first he played the part, courteous, quiet. He reviewed field reports, cross-referenced names, flagged errors in personnel logs. He corrected protocol breaches that others dismissed. He was helpful, efficient. Then he started asking questions, not dangerous ones, not yet, just enough to make people nervous. He never raised his voice. He never made accusations. He just asked, and people started answering too quickly. That's when he knew he had power. He began collecting favors. Nothing obvious, just small things. A falsified time code, a transferred prisoner, a reassigned officer, pieces on a board no one else could see until it was too late. He didn't need blackmail. He didn't need torture. He needed compliance. And compliance came easily to those who feared paperwork more than pain. Behind the scenes, he started drawing lines no one else noticed. How many senators had silent meetings with Kaminoan contractors? How many Republic outposts were sending reports that never reached the Council? How many Jedi were being followed without permission? He documented it all. He wasn't doing this for Sidious anymore. He was doing it for himself, not out of ambition, but to prove that fear didn't require screams. It just required the right question, asked at the right time. The Bureau began to change around him. Officers who once dismissed him started pausing when he walked past. His name was whispered behind closed doors, not with respect, but with calculation. Who did he report to? Why were his orders never challenged? Why did some files only open with his clearance? And the most dangerous question of all, why were people disappearing after speaking to him? He never answered. He just smiled. And that smile did more than any weapon. It made people doubt their safety. It made them afraid to lie. He began drafting revisions to policy, internal adjustments, security layers that answered only to him. On paper, he was still an analyst. In truth, he was becoming something else. A ghost in the Republic's systems, a surgeon of silence. Every small win gave him more room. Every lie exposed made him harder to challenge, because now people owed him. And he kept records of everything they feared, every officer, every diplomat, every military advisor who bent protocol to survive another day became part of his growing web. He didn't need to threaten them. He just needed to exist. Because the most dangerous thing about Malorum wasn't what he did. It was what he knew. And no one could tell how much that really was. Malorum learned that fear worked best when it arrived politely. He stopped summoning people to offices. He met them in corridors, in lifts, in quiet cafeterias between shifts, places where nothing official ever happened. He spoke softly, asked about families, about career paths, about transfers they wanted but never received. Then he asked one question that didn't belong, something small, something misplaced. And when the answer came, he smiled. That smile never reached his eyes. It made people lean closer. It made them talk longer than they should. It made them forget they were being measured. He became known as helpful, reliable, someone who could fix problems before they reached command, someone who understood discretion. That reputation spread faster than any threat. When officers made mistakes, Malorum was already there, with forms prepared, with solutions that required cooperation, with alternatives that sounded merciful. No one noticed the cost until it was too late. Files were altered, witnesses reassigned, prisoners transferred into holding cells that never appeared on maps. Jedi investigations slowed, then stalled, then vanished, and Malorum remained friendly through all of it. He learned how to sit across from a man and let silence do the work, how to nod without agreeing, how to let guilt fill empty space. He didn't need the Force to read minds. People revealed themselves when they believed they were safe. One senator cried in front of him, another begged, a third tried to bargain. Malorum listened to them all. He promised nothing and delivered exactly what he said he would, which was never the whole truth. Behind closed doors, he began coordinating with Imperial Security Bureau precursors, early formations, unnamed divisions that answered directly to the Chancellor's inner circle. Sidious didn't give him orders anymore. He gave him access. That was enough. Malorum began appearing on reports tied to Jedi disappearances, not as an executor, as an observer, a liaison, a presence that followed investigations without ever leading them. Jedi felt watched around him. They couldn't explain why. The Force gave them no warning because he didn't hate them. He didn't fear them. He simply understood how fragile their position really was. He studied their reactions, how they softened when spoken to kindly, how they trusted protocol, how they assumed evil would announce itself loudly. He was proof it didn't need to. One Jedi Knight questioned him openly, asked why intelligence was involved in temple affairs. Malorum answered calmly, provided documentation, offered cooperation. The Knight apologized. That night, the Knight's travel clearance was delayed. 2 days later, his ship vanished between systems. Malorum signed the report. He didn't celebrate. He adjusted. Each success refined him, made him more precise, less visible, more dangerous. People stopped asking who he worked for. They started asking how to stay out of his way. And he remained polite through all of it. The knife never showed its edge. Because the moment people realized what he was, it would stop working. So he stayed human, approachable, almost kind. And the Republic continued to bleed quietly beneath his hands. Some agents traded credits, others traded weapons. Malorum traded silence. It began with small things, a correction in a document, a shift in security logs, a delay in transmission reports that turned an error into an accident. Each favor came with a price, not one that had to be paid in credits, but in secrets. People spoke when they thought they were safe. They confessed in whispers, in late-night messages, in unguarded meetings that Malorum always found a way to attend. They spoke because he never judged them. They spoke because he never interrupted. They spoke because they feared what would happen if he stopped listening. He never blackmailed them directly. That wasn't his way. He didn't need leverage. He needed obedience. And obedience came more easily when people believed they were partners, not prisoners. Soon his office became a place of pilgrimage, an unofficial confession booth. Officers, informants, aides. They came with their sins, hoping Malorum could make them disappear. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. But he always remembered. He kept no data pads, no recordings, only memory, the kind that couldn't be hacked or traced. It made him untouchable, because if you challenged him, you didn't know what he might say. You didn't know what he might already know. He began to shape policy without writing a word. Decisions paused until he gave a nod. He never signed. He never claimed authority, but everyone waited for him to speak before moving forward, and he almost never spoke. It was the silence that gave him power. The longer he waited, the more they assumed he knew. Even Sidious noticed. One evening, deep beneath the Senate, Malorum stood across from his master. No lightsaber, no armor, just a man in plain robes and calm eyes. Sidious didn't laugh. He smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just enough to show he understood. Malorum wasn't like Maul, who raged, or Dooku, who doubted. He wasn't like Vader, whose power burned in public. He was different. He made fear polite. He made the Empire comfortable with cruelty. He understood that screaming was noise, and noise brought attention. But silence. Silence rewrote policy. Silence erased names. Silence built prisons without walls. He used that silence to cover up early Inquisitor experiments. He diverted attention from failed projects. He silenced rumors about Sidious's plans. And when he needed information, he simply waited. Because people always broke. Sometimes from guilt, sometimes from fear, but always from silence. He learned that a man left alone with his secrets would eventually confess, just to hear his own voice again. And Malorum was always there to listen, not with sympathy, but with interest, because every confession gave him another thread, another connection, another reason for someone to stay quiet the next time he called. He became a dealer in restraint. He didn't threaten to expose people. He reminded them what he hadn't said yet, and that was enough. The empire was not born in one night. It rose slowly, through policies, through betrayals, through people who convinced themselves they had no other choice. Malorum didn't force them to become part of it. He simply gave them the illusion of freedom, and the fear of what might happen if they used it. There were screams once, not many, but enough. Malorum learned quickly that screams had limits. They echoed. They left marks. They demanded attention. Even in secret facilities, even behind sealed doors, screams created questions. So he stopped using them. He let others do that work. Stormtroopers, interrogators, specialists whose names never appeared in official records. Malorum never watched closely. He never stayed long. He only read the outcomes. What mattered was not pain. What mattered was aftermath. He was present when the first Jedi was broken without torture. A former archivist, captured quietly, brought in without a fight. The Jedi expected violence, expected hatred, expected rage. Instead, Malorum offered water. He spoke calmly, asked about records, about missing holocrons, about old assignments. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He waited. Hours passed. The Jedi spoke, not because he was weak, but because silence became unbearable. That was when Malorum understood something permanent. Fear fades. Pain ends. But shame stays. He refined his method after that. He used comfort like a weapon, patience like a vice. He let prisoners explain themselves, let them believe they were convincing him. Then he let them realize they had already failed. That realization stayed with them longer than any wound. Soon, word spread. If Malorum was assigned to your case, you wouldn't scream, you would talk. The early Inquisitorius took shape around this truth, not as an army of hunters, but as an institution built on submission. Malorum didn't lead them. He shaped them. He advised recruitment, training, psychological screening. He selected those who understood restraint, those who didn't need anger to function, those who smiled. He trained them to wait, to listen, to make Jedi doubt themselves before they ever ignited a blade. Because a Jedi who doubted was already halfway defeated. Sidious watched from a distance. He allowed Malorum his autonomy, not out of trust, but because control was stronger when it believed it was earned. Malorum never challenged his master, not openly, but he learned something dangerous. He learned that the Sith didn't need dominance alone. They needed legitimacy. And legitimacy came from order, from systems, from men who smiled while cruelty became routine. By the time the Clone Wars deepened, Malorum's influence was everywhere. In delayed responses, in missing reinforcements, in Jedi missions rerouted into ambushes that looked like accidents. He never commanded troops. He moved paperwork, and the galaxy shifted with him. The smile became his signature. Officers recognized it. Prisoners feared it. Jedi underestimated it. It was calm, measured, human, and that was why it lasted. Because when the screams ended, the smile remained. It followed people home. It waited in their thoughts. It reminded them that Malorum knew something they didn't, and that silence was safer than resistance. By the end of this chapter of his life, Malorum had become something rare. Not a warrior, not a tyrant, but an architect. Someone who didn't need to be seen to be obeyed. Someone whose influence survived long after the room was empty. The Republic was still alive. The Jedi still stood. But beneath both, the rot had spread, quietly, patiently, with a smile. He didn't hear the words himself. Order 66 was not whispered to him through the Force or delivered through a coded channel. It wasn't meant for men like Malorum. It was meant for soldiers, for clones who had no choice, for Jedi who didn't see it coming. But when it happened, Malorum already knew. Not the exact moment, not the signal, but the feeling, the pause in the Senate, the hesitation in the Force, the sound of a galaxy exhaling, and then the silence. It wasn't immediate. At first it was confusion, a sudden flood of conflicting reports, Jedi bases going dark, temples no longer answering, patrols vanishing in mid-transmission, entire squads redirected without explanation. Malorum sat at his terminal and watched it unfold without blinking. He didn't ask questions. He just took notes. There were no screams in his part of the purge, only blank screens. The Jedi Temple fell first, not in hours, in minutes. Malorum didn't watch the footage. He didn't need to. He had already walked those halls. He knew every corridor, every defense protocol, every layer of security the Jedi had once thought sacred. None of it mattered. Not against someone like Anakin Skywalker, not against the 501st, not against a plan that had been growing in the dark for decades. Malorum received his orders later that day. Officially, he was now an Imperial Intelligence liaison. Unofficially, he was a cleanup specialist, not for the dead, but for the living. The survivors. The Jedi who ran. The Jedi who escaped. The Jedi who were still breathing. They weren't many, but they were dangerous because they remembered. And memory was something the new empire could not allow. Malorum wasn't sent to battlefields. He wasn't deployed with troops. He was sent to embassies, to outposts, to ports that hadn't reported any Jedi presence, but might have. His job was to make sure they never did. He visited governors, asked polite questions, reviewed logs, and when he found inconsistencies, he didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just smiled. And the records changed. Ships were erased from flight paths. Witnesses retracted statements. Bodies were mislabeled. Because Malorum understood something the clones never would. Killing a Jedi was easy. Killing the idea of a Jedi. That required something else. Not fire, but silence. Not destruction, but disappearance. So while Darth Vader hunted the survivors with his blade, Malorum hunted their names. He tracked whispers, used old records, cross-referenced council dispatches from the war, searched for patterns in places where no one else was looking. He found connections, small ones. A farmer on Lothal who used to be a temple groundskeeper, a freight captain whose cargo list always arrived late, but never incomplete, a librarian on Naboo who had no official birth record. None of them were Jedi, but some of them were hiding Jedi, or had seen one, or had helped one. Malorum followed them all. He never arrested. He never interrogated. He didn't need to know what happened next. He only needed to know that nothing would come back. The Order had fallen, but memory still flickered, and his job was to make sure it never reignited. Not with battles, but with edits. He didn't fight the Jedi. He erased them, one file at a time. The galaxy didn't change overnight. It just stopped pretending. Worlds that had once sent gifts to the Jedi now offered silence. Monuments were dismantled, statues removed, archives redacted. The Jedi were not mourned. They were erased, but not completely. Malorum knew better than most that even fire leaves embers, and the Jedi, those who lived, had no armies left, no allies, only shadows. So that's where he searched, not in cities, in the gaps between them, asteroid colonies, mining tunnels, abandoned stations orbiting dead stars. He read reports no one else cared to. He noticed forgotten requests for aid. He studied old maps the Senate had stopped funding. The purge had been public. His part of it was not. He wasn't chasing lightsabers. He was chasing patterns. On Dantooine, a farmer filed for medical supplies too advanced for soil work. On Salukami, a civilian ship avoided an entire sector, rerouting at the last second, without explanation. On Alderaan, a school teacher submitted paperwork, signed in the calligraphic style of the Jedi Temple. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they told a story. He marked each anomaly on a black star map. No lights, no borders, just data. And slowly, the shape of a hidden path began to form. It didn't point to one Jedi. It pointed to several, not together, scattered, alone, hiding in places the Order once touched, worlds where Jedi had helped during the war, planets where they had buried their dead, outposts where they had trained in secret decades ago, long before the war. He followed the trail without a single shot fired. He changed identities, traveled under different names, sometimes as a senator's aide, other times as a merchant, always blending in, always listening. He didn't need to see a lightsaber to know a Jedi had been there. He could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact, the way children spoke about heroes they weren't supposed to know, the way old wounds were dressed in new lies. On one outer rim moon, he found a wall with 6 names scratched into the rock, none of them local, all of them once part of the Order. He left no mark behind. He simply noted it and informed the right people. He wasn't trying to catch the Jedi himself. He was drawing the map for those who would. He worked alone, not by choice, by design, because even the Inquisitors didn't know how many Jedi were still alive. Even Vader didn't know everything. But Malorum knew more than he ever said. And that was why he was never questioned. Because the Emperor didn't care how he did it, only that it worked. Malorum studied the emotion left behind like others studied fingerprints. Not through the Force, but through fear, through change. He looked for gaps in behavior, a village where no one looked at you directly, a dock where every ship left 5 minutes early, a cantina where every patron grew silent when asked about shipments. It was always the silence that gave them away. He followed it, patiently. He marked the paths. He recorded the pauses. And when he was sure, he passed along the information. Then he moved on. No records, no praise, no witnesses, just another shadow, following others. In a galaxy where maps no longer showed where the Jedi once walked, Malorum was building one. And he was the only one reading it. Not every Jedi ran. Some stayed exactly where they were. Malorum learned this slowly, not from reports, from absence, from the kind of emptiness that only appeared when someone had chosen stillness instead of flight. These were the dangerous ones, not the knights who grabbed a ship and vanished into hyperspace, not the generals who tried to fight their way out and died loudly. These Jedi buried themselves inside ordinary lives. They cut their hair, changed their names, learned trades, lowered their presence in the Force until it became a whisper, barely felt even by themselves. They became farmers, mechanics, archivists, healers who never asked questions. They hid so well that even Vader missed them. Malorum noticed them because something was always slightly wrong. A moisture farmer who repaired machines too quickly, a dock worker who never missed a falling object, a medic whose patients healed better than statistics allowed. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just unlikely. He didn't rush. He watched from a distance, let weeks pass, sometimes months. He waited to see if the pattern broke. It almost never did. These Jedi had learned restraint the hard way. They avoided attachment, avoided heroics, avoided hope. They lived like ghosts who still needed food. Malorum respected that. He didn't see them as enemies. He saw them as unresolved problems. On a dust-choked moon near the mid-rim, he found a man who had once trained younglings. Now, he repaired water pumps. The locals trusted him, loved him. Malorum never confronted him. He filed a report describing infrastructure anomalies. Within days, Imperial surveyors arrived. Within weeks, the man was gone. No arrest record. No execution log. Just absence. On another world, he found a woman who worked in a data vault. She had been a Jedi researcher. She still protected knowledge, just quietly now. Malorum adjusted her clearance levels. Nothing else. She disappeared on her own. Fear did the work for him. That was the pattern. He didn't drag them into the light. He removed the shadows that protected them, because Jedi who hid relied on stillness, on routine, on being overlooked. Malorum disrupted routines. He changed supply routes, reassigned officials, introduced small delays that made people nervous. And nervous people noticed things. They asked questions. They remembered rumors. They pointed. The Jedi sensed it before it happened. They always did. But sensing danger didn't mean escape anymore. Not when ships were tracked, not when identities were monitored, not when silence itself was under surveillance. Some tried to run at the last moment. Malorum never followed them. He already knew where they were going. Old safe worlds, old friends, old habits. The Jedi had patterns too. They just didn't realize it. By now, the Inquisitors had begun hunting openly. Red blades, dark armor, fear made visible. Malorum stayed invisible. He sent information through channels that didn't trace back to him. Coordinates, timings, probabilities. He never watched the confrontations. He didn't need to. He read the aftermath, destroyed settlements, closed cases, reduced rumors. Each success made the galaxy quieter. Each disappearance removed another memory. But the ones who hid best stayed with him, because they hadn't tried to fight. They hadn't tried to rebuild the Order. They had simply tried to survive. And Malorum understood that instinct. He shared it. That was the cruelest part, because he knew exactly how to undo it. There were no funerals, no pyres, no rites, no Jedi Masters bowing in silence. The galaxy moved on without them, and Malorum made sure of it. He knew that death wasn't enough. That memory could survive long after bodies turned to ash. So he didn't just erase the Jedi, he erased the traces they left behind. No monument would stand, no temple would remain untouched, no datapad would hold their names unless it was hidden, sealed, or falsified. It started with the temple itself. After the assault, the archives were ransacked, officially by the new regime, unofficially by him. He moved through the shattered halls like someone returning to a dream already half forgotten. He recognized the walls, the chambers. Even the scent of scorched marble didn't cover the memories completely. He didn't linger. He went straight to the records tower. Some holocrons were gone. Others were damaged. But enough remained. Enough to rebuild the map of who they were. And enough to start deleting them. Not just their missions, their lineages, their students, their lives. The galaxy couldn't afford to remember the Jedi as they truly were. Not flawed, not arrogant, but real. Because real things are harder to forget. He filtered out names from Senate proceedings. He pulled their images from Republic broadcasts. He intercepted private comms from planetary governments that tried to mourn them. One by one, their echoes were muted. The Jedi weren't just gone. They were unspoken. Entire worlds began rewriting their history. Some did it willingly, others under pressure. Malorum made visits where he had to, calm ones, quiet ones. He didn't need to threaten planetary leaders. He showed them falsified evidence, suggested connections between Jedi visits and separatist attacks, left behind implications that silence was safer. They listened, and then they erased. The temples on Deveron and Ilum were stripped of their meaning. The enclave on Ossus was left to decay. The ruins on Dantooine, long since dormant, were finally buried by official decree. None of it happened loudly. It happened on paper, in meetings, in laws passed without debate. Malorum attended every session with the same expression: pleasant, patient, forgettable. That was how the Jedi were buried. Not with fire, with bureaucracy, with compliance, with collective fear, and when it was over, he began to forget them too. Not all of them. Some faces stayed, some names lingered, but the Order, what it had been, it faded, even in his own memory, because Malorum understood the truth of what he was doing, not just destroying the past, but replacing it, making room for something new, not stronger, not wiser, just more useful, more controlled. He wasn't proud of it, but he wasn't ashamed either, because shame is for people who believe in something. He didn't. Not anymore. He believed in silence. And in silence, the Jedi died. No final words, no graves, just darkness. And a galaxy that slowly learned to stop asking questions. The temple was quiet now. Not the silence of reverence. Not the silence of meditation. A colder silence. The kind that comes after something sacred has been broken. Malorum stood beneath the collapsed archways of the Jedi archives and didn't speak. Dust clung to the columns. The floors still held scorch marks from blaster fire. The scent of ash hadn't faded, even after months. The Jedi were gone, but their knowledge remained, not in holocrons. Those had been taken, cracked open, or hidden. It lived in the walls, in fragments buried in backup servers and misfiled memory banks, in scrolls stored behind shelves that hadn't been touched in decades. He came here alone, not under orders. Sidious had already taken what he wanted. Battle records, Jedi rosters, temple blueprints. He had no use for old prophecies or forgotten teachings. But Malorum did. He wasn't searching for survivors anymore. He was searching for meaning. The Purge had erased the Jedi from the present. But the past still spoke, faintly. He began deep in the sub-archives. No security, no guards. Just shelves too low to matter to most, and data cubes too old to interface with modern readers. He brought his own. He spent days scanning records by hand. He wasn't looking for names. He was looking for what came before names. The forgotten warnings, the suppressed truths. And slowly they began to surface. A coded scroll written 300 years before the fall, stored by a Jedi seer who'd vanished without trace. It referenced a darkness that would not rise through war, but through compliance. A meditation log, corrupted but partially restorable, speaking of a wound in the Force, deeper than any Sith could create. It didn't name Sidious. It described someone else, someone colder, someone watching. And then there were the voices, not literal, but recorded. Interviews, debriefs, visions transcribed by archivists. Some were broken, others incomplete, but all of them shared one thing. They spoke of endings, not the end of the Jedi, the end of memory, the end of truth, the end of the Force itself, falling silent. Malorum didn't understand all of it, but he didn't need to. He felt something shift inside him. A new question forming. What if Sidious hadn't read everything? What if his master had chosen only what served him and discarded the rest? And what if, buried beneath all this ruin, something had been left behind on purpose? He didn't tell anyone what he found, not the Inquisitors, not the Senate, not even his shadow contacts. He began compiling his own archive, hidden, encrypted. He didn't trust the Empire to preserve it, He didn't trust Sidious not to destroy it. These weren't answers yet, just fragments. But even fragments had power. He logged one file in particular, a set of verses traced back to an unknown Jedi mystic exiled during the new Sith Wars, and it ended with a warning. Malorum read the line twice, then 3 times, and he knew. He hadn't come here to destroy what the Jedi left behind. He had come here to understand why they were destroyed at all. Names have weight. The Jedi understood this once. That was why so many records were sealed, why entire bloodlines were reduced to symbols, why certain holocrons required living voices to open them. Malorum discovered those names by accident. He was cross-referencing exile records when a fragment surfaced, a partial index mislabeled during the last days of the Republic. It contained no biographies, no dates, only names, and each one was followed by the same mark, a restriction code older than the Empire, older than the Council itself. He didn't recognize most of them, but some echoed faintly, like sounds half-remembered from a dream. A Jedi who had predicted the fall of Coruscant and been dismissed as unstable. Another who spoke of eternal consciousness and was erased from temple teachings. A third whose name had been deliberately scratched out of every known archive. Malorum paused at that one, not because it was missing, but because it had been removed carefully. Someone had wanted it forgotten. He searched deeper. The names repeated across centuries, appearing in different eras, different scripts, different contexts, always suppressed, always incomplete. He realized then that the Jedi hadn't only hidden Sith knowledge, they had hidden fear. These were not dark side cultists, not fallen knights. These were Jedi who had asked the wrong questions. What happens after death? Can the Force remember? Does power end, or does it wait? Malorum felt something tighten in his chest. Sidious had spoken often of immortality, of essence transfer, of the body as a vessel. But these names, these records, they didn't describe domination. They described endurance. One entry referenced an ancient Sith experiment conducted after the rule of 2 was established. The name was there, but blurred. Another described a Jedi master who believed consciousness could anchor itself to places, not people. The Force as an echo, not a flame. Malorum stopped reading for a moment. He listened. The archives were silent, but the silence felt different now. He wasn't supposed to know this. He understood that instinctively. These were not truths meant for servants, not even trusted ones. Sidious had taken what he needed from the Jedi, but he had left behind what he feared. Malorum copied nothing directly. He memorized. He translated symbols into memory, converted fragments into mental maps. Because knowledge written down could be destroyed, knowledge carried could evolve. One name appeared again and again, always followed by contradiction. A Jedi who vanished during the new Sith Wars, declared dead. Malorum didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in persistence. And suddenly, the Empire's future felt less certain. If the Jedi had once studied immortality and failed, what had Sidious truly mastered? And what had he ignored? Malorum realized he was no longer searching for truth. He was searching for boundaries, for the edges of Sith power, and whether those edges could be crossed. He sealed the sub-archive and wiped his access trail. No alerts, no flags, no records of his visit, but the names stayed with him. They whispered in memory. not like voices, like pressure. And for the first time since the purge began, Malorum felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not doubt. Curiosity. Dangerous curiosity. Because once you learn that power has limits, you start thinking about what comes after. The Empire taught its agents not to ask questions, to follow, not to wonder. But Malorum had already broken that rule. And once a question takes root, it grows. He didn't speak of what he'd found, not even in the coded briefings he sent to the palace. He kept his thoughts buried, wrapped beneath layers of protocol and habit. But inside, he was beginning to drift. He asked questions in ways no one could trace. Requests for Old Republic records disguised as loyalty screenings. Inquiries into Jedi exile patterns written as background checks. Access requests sent under the names of departments that no longer existed. He became more careful, more patient, because the questions he was asking were not safe. He wanted to know what the Jedi had feared, what Sidious had ignored, what power looked like when it wasn't interested in control, but survival. He requested fragments of the fragments, stories broken across multiple archives, teachings incomplete by design, tales told in pieces, never whole. He found a report buried in the ruins of Ossus, describing a Force user who had meditated for a year without food. Another, from the days of Naga Sadow, spoke of a Sith who lived between moments, appearing only when remembered. A third referenced a being called only the Wound, who survived by feeding on absence. These were myths, but myths were born from something. He began mapping the overlaps, not by location, but by behavior. Patterns. Every figure he studied had something in common. They abandoned form. They separated self from identity. They let go of the Force, and then came back, changed. It disturbed him, because he was beginning to wonder if power was not something to hold, but something to survive. He found a record labeled Blackout Protocol, Jedi Biosuppression. Its language was clinical, emotionless. It described how Jedi who had seen too much were not killed, but rewritten. Their memories stripped, identities broken. They were placed into peaceful lives, far from the core. Not erased, recycled. Malorum stared at the file for a long time. Because if the Jedi had a protocol like this, so could the Sith. And suddenly he began to wonder, who was he? Really? His name was given to him, his purpose trained, his path written by someone else. He'd believed he was chosen. But what if he had been repurposed? What if his thoughts, his instincts, even his silence, had been shaped? He started avoiding Sidious, not openly. He still reported when summoned, still obeyed without question, but inside, something had broken. Not his loyalty, his certainty. He began to feel watched, not just by the Emperor, by the past, by something that lived in the words he wasn't supposed to read. He looked at the Inquisitors differently now, not as weapons, as mirrors. He looked at the Jedi differently too, not as enemies, as warnings. He stopped sleeping, not from fear, from fixation, because the questions weren't going away. They were following him, and in every silence, he could almost hear them forming again. What is the Force without the Jedi? What is power without the Sith? And what if there's something else beneath both? something older, something patient, something that never needed temples or empires, because it never died. Betrayal did not begin with rebellion. It began with omission. Malorum did not lie to the Emperor. He simply stopped telling him everything. Reports became shorter. Details vanished. Certain discoveries were delayed, then quietly forgotten. Sidious noticed the change. Not immediately. The Dark Lord was patient, confident. He believed control, once established, did not need constant reinforcement. That belief created space, and Malorum stepped into it. He created a second archive, not physical, not digital. A living archive, carried only in memory. Every forbidden name, every suppressed prophecy, every fractured teaching the Jedi had tried to bury. He treated it like a wound, kept it hidden, protected, painful, but alive. He began testing limits, small things at first, redirecting an inquisitor away from a potential discovery, flagging a ruin as unstable so it would be sealed instead of explored, classifying a recovered holocron as damaged beyond use. Each decision was defensible, each one unremarkable. Together, they formed a pattern. Malorum was no longer erasing the past. He was preserving pieces of it, not out of loyalty to the Jedi, but because he no longer trusted the Sith to tell the truth. He had seen how Sidious used knowledge, how he selected only what fed his own survival, how he destroyed anything that suggested limits. Malorum now believed limits mattered, because limits defined failure, and failure revealed what power feared most. He revisited the Jedi archives one final time, not to read, to listen. He sat alone in the dust, eyes closed, hands resting on scorched stone. He did not reach for the Force. He had never trusted it fully, but he remembered the temple as it was, the child he had been, the silence that shaped him, and he understood something with terrible clarity. The Jedi fell because they refused to see betrayal within themselves. The Sith would fall because they believed betrayal could only come from below. Malorum was neither Jedi nor Sith now. He was something in between, a listener, a keeper of things not meant to survive. He began laying contingencies, hidden protocols, dead drops of information disguised as corruption reports, instructions that would only make sense years later to people who didn't yet know they would need them. He wasn't planning a coup. He wasn't planning escape. He was planning for the moment when the Empire would turn inward, when Sidious would consume everything around him, when power would collapse under its own weight. Malorum intended to be ready, not to rule, to endure. That was his true betrayal, not against Sidious, but against the idea that power must always be visible, must always dominate, must always burn. He believed now in something quieter, something that waited, something that survived long after empires crumbled and names were forgotten. And in that belief, he crossed a line he could never return from. He was still the Emperor's shadow, still his knife, still his silence. But behind that silence, another voice had begun to form, low, patient, unfinished, and the galaxy would not hear it yet. But one day, it would. He didn't ask permission. Malorum filed a false itinerary, left behind a fabricated trail of meetings, and boarded a private transport under a name that didn't belong to him. He told no one, not the Bureau, not the Inquisitors, not even Sidious. He went to Naboo alone. It wasn't a mission. It wasn't even part of his duties. The Jedi were gone. The purge was winding down. His presence was needed elsewhere. But something had changed. Something inside him. A fracture. A hunger. It started with the archives, but it didn't end there. The pieces he'd uncovered whispered of deeper truths. Truths hidden beneath the stories told by both Jedi and Sith. Power that didn't shine. Power that didn't burn. Power that waited. Naboo was not random. It was the birthplace of Padme Amidala, the home of the Gungans, a world of beauty and ceremony, known more for its artists and lakes than its secrets. But Malorum wasn't drawn to its surface. He was drawn to what lay beneath it. Decades ago, Darth Sidious had hidden something here. Something older than the Clone Wars. Something Malorum had only glimpsed in a corrupted transmission buried in a forgotten channel. Coordinates tied to an ancient Sith cipher, encrypted inside a shipment manifest labeled as food supplies during the early years of the war. He knew what it meant. Sidious had used Naboo, not just as a mask, but as a vault. And now Malorum wanted to see what his master had buried. He landed outside Theed, on the edge of one of the minor floodplains, far from the city's gaze. No security, no escort, just the open air and the weight of his own curiosity. He moved beneath the palace, not through official entrances, through the underworks, sewer paths, forgotten stairwells, and tunnels used centuries ago for waste management during the Naboo civil expansion. Most believed they had collapsed during the last seismic flood. They hadn't. He followed the silence, downward. The light changed slowly, from natural reflection to artificial flicker. The walls began to shift, from engineered stone to something older, rougher, Sith-made. He passed symbols carved into black basalt, not words, not warnings, bindings. The deeper he went, the less the Force responded. It didn't pull him. It didn't push him away. It just watched. When he reached the final chamber, he didn't breathe. Not because of fear, because something in the air told him to be still. The room was circular, wide, empty, except for a single obsidian altar in the center, and on its surface, a grid of shallow grooves, each shaped to hold something now missing. But this wasn't a temple. It was a vault, a ritual space, a place not meant for worship, but transformation. Malorum stepped inside. The sound of his footfalls disappeared. The Force grew thin, like something had fed on it. He didn't touch anything. He didn't have to. He felt it. This was where Sidious had learned something, not from books, from practice. And whatever it had been, it was not meant to be shared. That was when Malorum knew he wasn't Sidious's heir. He was his tool, and tools could be discarded, unless they made themselves dangerous, unless they learned what their master tried to hide. Malorum stood in the dark and made a choice. He would not betray the Emperor tomorrow, But the seed had been planted, and deep below the surface of Naboo, it had already begun to grow. He returned at night. The surface of Naboo slept peacefully, unaware of the darkness beneath it. Theed's towers reflected moonlight. The people walked with calm. There were no alarms, no warnings. But beneath the palace, Malorum was preparing something forbidden. He didn't copy the ritual. He reconstructed it, piece by piece, phrase by phrase, from half-burned Sith scrolls recovered during the Clone Wars, from memory fragments he wasn't supposed to keep, from whispers buried in the archives disguised as myths. He wasn't trying to summon anything. He was trying to understand what Sidious had done and why he had hidden it here. The altar was still cold when he returned, the chamber still silent, but the space felt attentive, as if it remembered. He stood before the obsidian stone and began to mark the floor. Chalk mixed with powdered metal, taken from a corrupted lightsaber crystal found during an earlier mission. It hummed faintly. The Sith language was not spoken aloud. It was etched, impressed into form. Malorum didn't have full translations. He didn't need them. He understood the shape of fear. He understood what the old Sith believed, that power could be anchored, that death was a failure of control, that the Force was not a gift, but a field to be claimed. He traced the final sigil, then sat in silence. The ritual didn't require blood, not at first. It required memory. He offered his own, not in words, but in presence. He let his mind walk backward, to his first day in the temple, to the moment Sidious found him, to the day the Jedi fell. Each image not remembered, but surrendered. The altar responded, not with sound, with pressure. The air thickened, the light dimmed, though no source changed. And then something flickered beneath the stone. Not energy, memory. Malorum saw faces, not visions, impressions. They stared through him, unblinking, unknown. He recognized none of them, but they recognized him. A boy twisted into silence, a servant who listened too closely, a shadow that forgot its leash. He didn't break contact, even when his head began to burn, even when the chamber blurred at the edges. This was what Sidious had touched. This was how the Emperor had become more than a Sith. He hadn't learned to cheat death. He had learned to rewrite meaning, to bend the Force, not with strength, but with sacrifice. Malorum stayed until the pressure eased, until the flickering stopped. When he opened his eyes again, the markings were gone, erased, as if they had never existed. But something was different. The chamber no longer felt empty. It felt aware, not alive, present, as though a piece of him had been taken. But something else left in its place. Not power, not visions, understanding. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady, his breath shallow, and he knew, without question, Sidious had used this ritual, but he had not completed it. Or perhaps he had chosen not to, not out of fear, out of arrogance, because the Emperor believed he didn't need it anymore. Malorum did. He didn't believe he was ready to challenge Sidious, not yet. But he knew now that power had depths even the Sith hadn't finished digging. And in this place, in this forgotten chamber, buried beneath the throne of an empire that didn't yet know it would fall. He had taken the first step toward betrayal. not with a weapon, but with a memory the dark could not erase. He returned to Coruscant changed. No one noticed. Not the guards, not the aides, not the other shadows who circled the Emperor like insects drawn to fire. Malorum looked the same. He smiled the same. He obeyed the same. But something inside him had shifted. It wasn't ambition. It was clarity. The ritual on Naboo hadn't granted him power. It had granted him awareness. That Sidious, unquestioned, untouchable, was not a god. He was a man who had stolen rituals, silenced history, and left just enough of it buried to protect himself from what he didn't fully understand. Malorum began to hear whispers again, not through the Force, through instincts, through the places his mind returned to when he was alone. They weren't the Emperor's voice. They weren't commands. They were echoes, remnants of the ritual, not instructions, invitations. He started reading differently, not for facts, for omissions. He scanned old Sith histories for what they avoided, the gaps, the blanks, the teachings marked incomplete, and in every one, he saw the same pattern. The Sith feared what they couldn't control. They feared permanence. They feared legacy not crafted by their own hands. And yet, Sidious had built his empire on exactly that. A cycle, an order, a mask of structure. Malorum saw the contradiction. The dark side wasn't meant to last. It was meant to consume. And yet Sidious had tried to contain it, bind it, use it like a formula. But there were things that didn't follow formulas, things that whispered beneath rituals, that watched through stone, that waited behind memory. Malorum began to write in code, not for others, for himself. Fragments, dreams, images that didn't feel like his, recorded in a language only he remembered. They came in quiet moments, in dreams without sleep, a hall of red mirrors, a staircase without end, a hand that reached from beneath broken stone and never touched, only pointed, always pointing downward. He didn't tell Sidious. He didn't tell anyone, because some part of him began to believe maybe these weren't visions. Maybe they were instructions, left by something older, something the Sith had tried to silence, but couldn't. He cross-referenced ancient maps with forgotten tombs, not the famous ones, the ones no one wrote about, the ones only hinted at in footnotes, marked dangerous, then erased. He studied them the way a spy studies a locked door, not to open it, to learn what someone was trying so hard to keep closed. The whispers grew stronger when he asked questions, but they never answered directly. They reminded him of something else. Malorum finally understood what that meant. The Emperor feared contradiction, feared other voices, not just in the Senate, in the Force. That's why he erased them, not because they were wrong, because they were louder than his. Malorum had no interest in shouting. He had learned to listen. And now, something was listening back. He began to visit places Sidious had ordered closed, tombs marked unstable, artifacts marked corrupted. He didn't touch them. He stood near them, let the air settle, let the dust move, and waited, because what the Emperor feared most wasn't rebellion. It was silence that didn't belong to him, and Malorum had begun to carry exactly that. Fear did not leave him all at once. It thinned, like fog burned away by a rising sun, slow and quiet, until one day he noticed it was gone. Malorum still bowed when Sidious entered a room. He still answered questions with care, still carried out orders without hesitation. But inside, the weight that had once pressed his thoughts into obedience had lifted. The Emperor was powerful, but power, Malorum now understood, was not the same as inevitability. Sidious ruled through certainty, through the belief that no path existed beyond the one he had designed, that every secret worth knowing already belonged to him. Malorum had seen otherwise. He began testing the Emperor's awareness, not with open defiance, with absence. He delayed minor reports, reassigned operatives without explanation, let certain relics vanish into sealed vaults marked unstable. Each time he waited. Sidious noticed none of it, or noticed and dismissed it. That was worse, because it meant the Emperor no longer watched him closely. Malorum remembered the day Sidious had found him, a child measured and chosen, a tool sharpened and shaped. He had believed that moment defined his life. Now he saw it differently. It had only begun it. Sidious did not understand endurance. He believed the dark side rewarded domination, that the strongest voice would always drown out the rest. But the voices Malorum had heard were not loud. They persisted, and persistence frightened the Sith far more than rebellion ever could. During a private audience, Sidious spoke of Vader, of the Jedi who still slipped through the cracks, of control tightening across the outer rim. Malorum listened and felt nothing, no awe, no fear, just distance. He realized then that the Emperor's greatest strength, his certainty, was also his weakness. Sidious did not imagine being replaced. He imagined being obeyed. Malorum had stopped obeying in the only way that mattered. He no longer believed. He didn't dream of overthrowing the Emperor. He wasn't building an army. He wasn't seeking a throne. He was preparing for after, for the moment when the dark would consume itself, for the silence that followed. That was where Malorum intended to exist. Sidious asked him a question, a simple one. Malorum answered carefully. The Emperor studied him, longer than usual. The Force stirred, but it found no lie, because Malorum believed what he said. What he had found was not value, it was truth, and truth did not belong to the Sith. Sidious turned away, satisfied. That was the moment Malorum understood completely. The Emperor could sense deception, but not divergence. He could feel betrayal born of hunger, but not betrayal born of patience. Malorum was no longer his servant. He was his blind spot. He left the chamber without trembling, without relief, without triumph, just clarity. The seed planted on Naboo had taken root, not as ambition, as independence. He would continue to serve, continue to smile, continue to erase and listen and wait. But his loyalty now belonged to something else, not the Jedi, not the Sith, to survival beyond empires, to knowledge that refused to die. to the quiet power of being forgotten when the galaxy burned. Malorum did not fear his master anymore, because he had learned something Sidious never would. Power that demands worship is temporary. Power that waits endures. There were no screams, not in the beginning. Just rows of chairs, uniforms without names, eyes that didn't blink fast enough. The silence of children waiting to be told who they were. Malorum stood at the edge of the Imperial Youth Training Division and said nothing. He watched. He listened. He counted how long each child took to look away. Most broke eye contact in under 5 seconds. A few held his gaze longer. Those were the ones he marked. He wasn't a teacher. He wasn't listed on any curriculum. Officially, he was an external advisor, assigned by Imperial Intelligence to help with discipline structuring and behavioral compliance models. Unofficially, he was something else. He was looking for the future, or the version of it that could be shaped. The Empire was growing faster than it could manage. Systems were being pacified, cultures rewritten, families lost, and children were left behind. Too many, too angry, too alone. The solution was obvious. Control them young, shape them early, break them quietly. Malorum didn't invent the youth program, but he saw what it could become. He asked for access to the special development tracks, the orphans whose records had already disappeared. No ties, no history, no one who would come looking if something went wrong. He watched them during morning drills. He asked their instructors for silence during tests. He introduced variables, hunger, sleep deprivation, unsolvable puzzles with fake answers. He wasn't studying intelligence. He was studying surrender. How quickly would they betray a friend? How long before they gave up trying to be understood? How soon would they start mimicking the voice of their oppressor? He didn't call it cruelty. He called it measurement. And when one broke too fast, he marked them for reassignment. Too weak. When one refused to break at all, he sent them to the mines. Too slow. He was looking for something specific. Obedience without trust. Loyalty without love. A mind that didn't want approval, only clarity. It was rare, but not impossible. And in the meantime, the program expanded. More worlds, more children, more rooms filled with uniforms and stillness. The instructors asked him for direction. He gave them scripts, nothing personal, nothing emotional. Correct them with silence, reward them with routine, isolate those who cry, record those who don't. He visited once a week, always unannounced, always alone. He walked through rows of children and waited to feel something, admiration, fear, curiosity, anything, but mostly, they just looked through him exactly as he wanted, until one day, one didn't. A child in the back row, head tilted slightly, eyes unmoving, not defiant, not scared, just aware. Malorum stopped walking. The instructor continued speaking. The child didn't look away. He said nothing, and neither did Malorum. But something changed. For the first time in months, Malorum felt the air shift. The others returned to their tasks. The lesson ended. But the child kept watching. And when Malorum turned to leave, he didn't feel alone. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But something in him began to calculate, and it felt almost familiar. Fear moved faster than lessons. Malorum understood this before the instructors did, before the Empire wrote it into manuals, before the children learned to hide their hands when they shook. Loyalty took time. Fear did not. So he reshaped the program, not by adding violence, by removing comfort. He shortened meal windows, not enough to starve, enough to distract. He adjusted sleep cycles so dreams ended early and mornings began in confusion. He changed instructors often, so no voice stayed long enough to feel familiar. Stability created attachment. Attachment created weakness. Fear created clarity. The children learned the rules quickly. Speak only when spoken to. Never ask why. Never expect fairness. Those who followed the rules were not rewarded. They were ignored. That was the lesson. Approval was temporary. Silence was permanent. Malorum watched how fear rewired them, how posture changed, how voices flattened, how friendships dissolved without orders being given. They stopped calling each other by names. They used numbers instead. He saw children report one another for violations that hadn't occurred, saw them rehearse confessions before being questioned, saw them learn how to disappear inside routine. This was not indoctrination. This was erosion. And it worked. The instructors were uncomfortable at first. They asked if the methods were too severe, if the children should be reminded why they served the Empire. Malorum answered calmly. Belief fades. They stopped asking. Some children resisted longer than expected. They held on to stories of parents, of homes, of before. Malorum removed those stories. He erased archived birth records, rewrote intake files, told them their homes no longer existed. Some cried. Some went silent. Some changed. Those who changed fastest became examples, not promoted, displayed. He allowed the others to see what survival looked like. It wasn't strength. It was emptiness. The force-sensitive ones reacted differently. A few tried to hide it. A few didn't know what it was. A few used it without meaning to. Faster reflexes, sharper awareness, unnatural calm. Malorum noticed them immediately. He didn't separate them yet. He wanted to see what fear did to power. Some lost it. Some buried it. And one learned how to turn it inward. That one interested him. Malorum began to speak to the children more often. Not lectures. Questions. He never answered. He let them answer for themselves. Fear made them honest. It stripped away hope and left instinct. And instinct revealed potential. The Empire believed it was building soldiers. Malorum knew better. It was building survivors, not heroes, not leaders. Weapons that didn't ask to be held. He didn't stay long in the classrooms anymore. He watched through observation feeds, through reports, through the quiet changes in behavior charts, and every time fear accelerated growth, he noted it. This was not Vader's method. This was not the Inquisitors. This was something else, something colder, something permanent. And as the children learned to obey without reward, Malorum felt a strange recognition. They were becoming like him, stripped of choice, defined by function, unburdened by attachment. He did not feel guilt. He felt confirmation. Fear was faster. Fear was cleaner. Fear didn't argue. And in the Empire's classrooms, fear was doing what loyalty never could. It was building silence. Most of them did. That was the truth Malorum never argued with. Given enough isolation, Enough uncertainty, enough quiet pressure. Most minds folded. Some loudly, some slowly, some so completely that nothing recognizable remained. But not all. A small number resisted in ways fear could not erase. They didn't cry longer. They didn't fight harder. They adapted. Malorum noticed them because they stopped reacting. Where others flinched at raised voices, they stayed still. Where others rushed to answer, they waited. Where others betrayed quickly, they calculated first. Fear passed through them and left nothing behind. Those were the ones Malorum studied personally. He requested their files under pretense of evaluation. He watched recordings of their sessions alone, late into the night. He replayed moments instructors missed, a child who learned the routine too quickly, another who began predicting punishments before they came, one who stopped sleeping, not from anxiety, but from vigilance. These were not broken children. They were hollowing themselves out. On one occasion, an instructor tried to punish a girl for refusing to respond during drills. She stood still while the others were forced to watch. Hours passed. She didn't move. When asked why, she answered simply. Malorum read the report twice, then flagged her for observation, not discipline. Another boy began completing impossible puzzles by ignoring the instructions entirely. When confronted, he said nothing. He just looked at the floor and waited. He wasn't defiant. He had learned that rules were often traps. Malorum understood that instinct. He didn't intervene directly. He adjusted conditions. He paired the resilient children with weaker ones. Watched who protected, who exploited, who remained detached. Some failed. Some hardened. One began to observe Malorum, observing them. That one concerned him, because that child did not fear authority. He feared inefficiency. The Empire had expected obedience. Malorum had expected survival. What he found was something else. Children who learned to exist without belief, without hope, without loyalty. They weren't devoted to the Empire. They weren't even afraid of it anymore. They were learning how to endure systems by becoming smaller than them, invisible. That was dangerous, because invisible things lasted. Malorum began to separate them quietly, transferred them to advanced tracks, specialized programs, units without names, not apprentices, not yet. He wanted to see how far they could go without guidance. How much could be stripped away before something essential vanished? He didn't tell Sidious about them, not because he feared the Emperor, because he didn't want interference. These children were not weapons yet. They were proofs, evidence that fear did not only destroy, it refined. And refinement produced something the Sith had never fully understood. Control without passion, power without hunger, endurance without faith. Malorum began to wonder if the Jedi had once seen this too. If that was why they feared attachment so deeply, not because attachment led to darkness, but because detachment led to something colder, something harder to stop. He watched as one child manipulated others without raising his voice. Another learned to vanish from reports. A third learned how to wait through punishments until they were forgotten. They were not leaders. They were not heroes. They were survivals given form. And for the first time since Naboo, Malorum felt a familiar calculation return. He wasn't just watching these children. He was selecting. Because among them, he sensed something rare. Not force potential, not ambition, but recognition. The same recognition he had once felt. The awareness that the world was a system, and systems could be endured or broken. He didn't know her name. Names weren't given in that facility. But she had eyes that didn't look down when spoken to. They didn't rebel. They didn't plead. They simply met his gaze and held it. Most children, even the strongest, learned to glance away, to show deference, to hide the pulse of thought behind lowered lids. This one didn't. She was 11 standard years old when Malorum first noticed her directly. Small for her age, unremarkable in tests, quiet in groups. But the camera feeds told a different story. She never spoke first, never volunteered, never defied an order. But she was always listening, and she remembered everything. When others whispered about escape, she stayed silent. When they cried at night, she stayed still. When instructors asked questions, she watched their tone, not their words. She had already learned what others hadn't, that in the Empire's halls, information meant survival. But it wasn't just her stillness that interested him. It was the way she watched him. Malorum entered classrooms rarely, always flanked by officers, always silent. Yet every time, without fail, she noticed. Not with awe, not with fear, with recognition. It was like she saw what he had once seen in Sidious, the shape behind the smile, the shadow behind the words, and she mirrored it. He tested her subtly, altered lesson plans, replaced instructors mid-cycle, changed the cadence of alarms during sleep drills. She adapted too quickly. She never looked surprised. She never looked relieved. She simply moved forward, like she already knew the system would fail her. And still, when he visited, she looked at him. One day, he paused longer than usual at the viewing glass. She was seated with others, pretending to eat. The moment his shadow crossed the doorway, she lifted her eyes and smiled. It wasn't warm, it wasn't mocking, it was aware. A silent signal across a room of silence. She knew what this place was doing. She knew who was behind it. And she had accepted both, not as fate, as foundation. She was not resisting the Empire, she was learning from it. Malorum requested her file that night. It was thin, fabricated like the rest. No parent names, no homeworld. A reclassified citizen of the New Order. No record of force sensitivity. No disciplinary history. No commendations. She had built a perfect absence. He reviewed footage of her younger cycles. She had once spoken more, asked questions, reached out to others. That stopped at age 9. He found no trigger, only silence. That silence had become armor, and now it was a mirror. For the first time, Malorum felt something stir that wasn't calculation. It wasn't empathy, it was curiosity. Had she become this because of him, or had she always been this, waiting for a world that fit? He brought her in for a private interview. No questions, no offers. Just presence. They sat in silence for 15 minutes. She didn't squirm, didn't blink often, didn't smile this time. At the end, Malorum spoke only once. She nodded. She paused, then shook her head. He watched her eyes. No flicker, no mask, just stillness. That night, Malorum altered her records. No more public evaluations, no transfers, no names, just a single red mark in her file, for his eyes only. They didn't say his name out loud, not anymore. Not in the halls of the Senate, not in the chambers of Imperial intelligence. Even those who owed him everything, their ranks, their secrets, their silence, began to lower their voices when his name came up. Because something was wrong with Malorum. The change had started slowly, a missed briefing, an unapproved surveillance order. Small things at first, but they built up, like cracks in a mirrored mask. He had once been the Emperor's ghost, moving through layers of bureaucracy with a smile, wrapping truth in lies with such calm precision that even the Jedi had barely noticed his presence. But now, there were too many questions, too many quiet shifts in policy, and someone had started noticing. It was Bail Organa who raised the first alarm. A senator with eyes too sharp and patience too dangerous for the Empire to fully control. He didn't say Malorum's name either, not at first, but his aides began asking questions about funding, about disappearances, about children. They were subtle as rebels could be, but Malorum saw it, felt it, like shadows watching from behind closed doors. He didn't panic, not yet, but he started rearranging things, moving personnel, sealing records, erasing logs that had once made him proud, because he knew the smell of a hunt, and for the first time, he wasn't the one doing it. The agents under him could sense it too. They had followed him out of fear, but also out of awe. His ability to predict, to manipulate, to silence without force. It had made him more than a man to them, a weapon, a legend. But now they saw hesitation where certainty had lived. They saw the pause between orders, the sleepless nights behind locked office doors. And worse, they saw that he no longer answered directly to the Emperor. He told them it was a new chain of command, a reorganization, a quiet directive. And most believed him. But rumors live longer than orders, and a new rumor had begun. A rumor that somewhere, far from Coruscant, a former Jedi was alive. Not just alive, but interfering, blocking Malorum's movements, warning targets before they vanished, deleting files that should have been buried in unmarked vaults. His name was Ferrus Olin, and Malorum hated how familiar that name felt. He remembered Olin from the temple, from a time when the Force still shimmered through halls of stone and light. He had never spoken to him, never trained with him, but the name lingered, not because of power, not because of fame, but because of what Olin had walked away from. The Order. Before the Purge. Before it all ended. And now that same Jedi had returned and was unraveling everything Malorum had built in silence. The first confirmed interference was on Belassa. A supply route had gone dark. Surveillance teams found their equipment disabled, with no trace of a fight, no bodies, just a faint echo in the Force that chilled the most sensitive agents to their bones. Malorum didn't speak during the debrief. He just stared at the hollow projection of the empty base. He already knew. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't the work of spies. It was Olin. But what made it worse, far worse, was that someone in the Senate had helped him. And suddenly, Malorum wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. He was being watched by them. From that day forward, the whispers didn't stop, and neither did the silence inside him, not even when he tried to meditate. not even when he tried to sleep. Ferrus Olin was supposed to be dead, not officially, not publicly, but in the way the Empire preferred its enemies to be, erased so completely that even memory gave up looking for them. Malorum had seen the file himself years ago. Olin had vanished before the Purge, slipped away during the confusion of the Clone Wars. No execution order, no confirmed body, just absence. That kind of absence was dangerous. Most Jedi who survived Order 66 ran loudly. They fled into the Outer Rim, joined resistance cells, tried to rebuild something broken. Olin did none of that. He waited, and that made him harder to find. The first reports described him as a rumor, a voice that warned settlers to leave before Imperial raids, a figure seen once and never again, a Jedi who never ignited his blade unless there was no other choice. Malorum dismissed the early sightings. He shouldn't have, because when Olin moved, he moved through Malorum's territory, through systems already cleaned, through records already buried, through silence that had once belonged to him alone. That was not coincidence. That was intent. Olin wasn't fighting the Empire. He was unraveling Malorum. The realization settled slowly, like frost. Every disrupted operation shared a pattern. Supplies redirected at the last moment. Inquisitor teams arriving minutes too late. Witnesses gone, but not frightened. Relieved. Someone was undoing fear. And that terrified Malorum more than open rebellion ever could. He ordered a deeper investigation. Not through official channels, through the old network, the one he trusted because no one else remembered it existed. They brought back fragments. Olin had been seen on Alderaan, speaking with Bail Organa, not hiding, speaking openly. Malorum felt something tighten behind his eyes. Organa was careful. He never acted without layers of deniability. If he was meeting a Jedi openly, it meant he believed the Emperor could not touch him, or that someone had promised protection. Malorum replayed old memories of the temple, of records half-read, of names erased too carefully. Olin had always been a problem for the Jedi, too observant, too willing to leave. He didn't fall to the dark side. He walked away from the light. And now he had returned with something worse than anger. Perspective. Malorum requested surveillance authorization on Organa's inner circle. The request was denied, not by Sidious, by protocol. That should not have happened. Someone was interfering, someone close. That night, Malorum dreamed for the first time in years, not of Naboo, not of the archives, but of the temple. He stood in a corridor filled with doors, each one sealed, each marked with a name. Olin's door was open. Inside, there was nothing, just light. When Malorum woke, he knew the truth he had been avoiding. Ferrus Olin was not a loose end. He was a mirror, a man who had seen the same corruption and chosen a different response. Olin had rejected the Sith, Malorum had adapted to them, and now the galaxy was watching to see which path endured. The next report confirmed it. An Inquisitor squad vanished near Corellia. No wreckage, no bodies, no trace of the dark side. Only a single message burned into a terminal wall. Malorum stared at the words for a long time, not because they threatened him, but because they didn't. Olin wasn't afraid of the Empire. And worse, he wasn't afraid of Malorum. He watched Corellia burn from orbit, not with fire, not like Vader would have done, but with something colder. A purging of records, a silencing of names, the erasure of a community built on quiet dissent. He'd spent weeks planning it, not to draw Olin out, but to send a message. If you protect them, they disappear anyway. But when it was done, and the ships returned to their docking bays, and the troopers offered no resistance to his orders, Malorum felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, not even fear. Only silence. The same silence that had followed him since Naboo, since he began walking his own path. He stood alone in the command center as the reports came in. Success, efficiency, no surviving witnesses. But the word he listened for, the name, was never spoken. Olin wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. He was never where the fire was. He moved in the shadows left behind. Malorum returned to his quarters and activated the secure holo recordings, the ones no one else could access. The faces of every dissenter he'd tracked. Every senator who whispered, every officer who questioned. They blurred together now, a sea of potential threats, none as clear, none as personal. Only one face kept returning. And it wasn't Olin's. It was his own, reflected in a screen, staring back, older, angrier, afraid. Because the closer he came to eliminating Olin, the more he began to understand the nature of the threat. It wasn't about sabotage. It wasn't even about rebellion. It was about truth. Olin didn't need to defeat the Empire. He just needed to show that it could be resisted, quietly, patiently, and Malorum hated him for it, because it was working. Because for the first time since the Purge, people had begun to believe again. Not in the Jedi, not in the Republic, but in the possibility that the darkness wasn't absolute. And belief was a weapon more dangerous than any lightsaber. Malorum issued a new directive. All known associates of Ferrus Olin were to be detained. No trial, no files, no broadcasts, just disappearance. A mirror of the tactic the Empire had used for years. But this time, he didn't inform the Emperor. This was his hunt, his war. And he needed to win it alone. Because if he failed, if Olin continued, then the cracks would widen. The mask would fall. And someone, somewhere, would ask the question no one had dared ask yet. Who gave Malorum the right? He stared at his reflection again. Not in a screen this time, in the window. The stars outside did not blink. They simply watched, like the Force itself was waiting. He turned away, not because he feared it, but because he didn't want to see what it might be showing him. There was one last move to make, a place untouched, sacred. The ruins of the Jedi Temple still stood on Coruscant, officially sealed, but Malorum still had access, not through authority, through memory. He would go there. He would find the source of Olin's strength, and he would break it. Because if there was one thing he still believed, it was that truth, no matter how bright, could be buried. Just like the Jedi. Just like the past. Just like him. The temple was colder than he remembered. Not in temperature, in presence. No warmth lingered, no echoes of the council, no whisper of the past. The marble floors were cracked but swept clean. The long halls no longer hummed with life. It was a place of silence, of endings. Malorum moved carefully, as if the walls were watching, as if they remembered who he was, a failed Padawan, a shadow among giants, now returned, not as a Jedi, not even as a Sith, but something else. He told himself he had come to lay the past to rest, to reclaim the secrets hidden beneath the archives. But that wasn't true. Not fully. He had come to see if the temple still feared him. It didn't. He walked the old paths, past sealed rooms and broken statues until he reached the vault below. He knew the code. The Jedi hadn't changed it in time. When the doors opened, he expected power. Instead, he found a mirror, literally, a large unmarked surface placed before a fractured wall. It hadn't been there before, not when he was a student, not even during the purge. He stepped closer, and his reflection greeted him. But it wasn't alone. Behind his own image, another face flickered, familiar, cold, a shadow wearing a smile. Ferris Olin, not physically, not real, but remembered, or projected. He reached out. The surface rippled. A force vision, but not one born of fear. Not this time. It was born of doubt. The force was warning him, or mocking him. He had spent years mastering fear, controlling the unknown. Yet here, where the light had once ruled, the dark did not obey him. He staggered back, not from pain, from recognition, because the face in the mirror, the one beside Olin's, was changing, shifting, aging. It was his own. But it wasn't him. It was the version of Malorum that had never served Sidious, never tortured for secrets, never disappeared into smiles and whispers. It was the Jedi he could have been, and it hated him. He turned away, heart racing, pulse rising, and caught his reflection again in the polished wall. Still him. Still alone. But now he understood. He was being haunted, not by ghosts, by possibilities, by everything he had given up just to be noticed, just to matter. And still, no one feared him the way they feared Vader. No one respected him the way they once respected the Council. He was a footnote in a regime that no longer needed him, a shadow pretending to cast a shape. Back on the surface, Malorum stood beneath the night sky of Coruscant. He watched the city breathe. The Empire moved around him, unaware. He pulled the hood over his head and walked slowly away from the temple, blending into the noise. He didn't speak, not to his guards, not to the sky, not to himself, because now he feared what his own voice might sound like. The network he'd built was fraying. The children he'd trained no longer trusted him. The whispers had grown louder, and Ferris Olin had vanished again, this time not into hiding, into legend. And legends were harder to kill. He reached the edge of the district and paused. There were no more missions, no more orders from the Emperor, only silence. The same silence that greeted traitors. He looked up, and for a moment he thought he saw himself in every window, watching, waiting, judging, and somewhere deep inside, he began to wonder if he still existed at all. He chose Naboo because memory was strongest there, not his memory alone, the galaxies. Naboo had always been a quiet world, too beautiful for war, too calm to notice what moved beneath its surface. It was where Padme Amidala had lived, ruled, and died. A name spoken softly even now, years later, with a kind of unfinished grief. Malorum returned without escort, no banners, no authority codes, no announcement. To the Empire, he was still loyal, still useful, still invisible. But that invisibility was thinning, and he could feel it like cold air through a cracked door. Ferrus Olin was close. So was the Emperor. Both were hunting him now, for different reasons. Naboo welcomed him the same way it always had, with still water, with pale stone, with silence that felt older than the Republic itself. He landed far from Theed, near the floodplains where the light bent across the surface of glassy lakes. He didn't look toward the palace. He went beneath it. The tunnels were unchanged. The old Sith stone still absorbed sound. The ritual chamber still existed, sealed from casual discovery, ignored by those who believed the past had already been claimed. Malorum stepped into the chamber and felt the weight return. Not power, judgment. He had not come to perform another ritual. He had come to understand why Padme had died. The question had haunted him for years. Official records blamed stress, grief, a broken heart, convenient answers for an empire that needed myths, not contradictions. But Malorum had seen enough truth buried under truth to know better. Padme had been close to the center of everything, to Anakin Skywalker, to Palpatine, to the final collapse of the Jedi, and people that close did not simply fade. He activated a hidden recorder and let it scan the chamber's residual memory. Not the Force, not fully, something else. Echo. The chamber responded faintly, like stone remembering heat long gone. Images surfaced. Padme standing alone in her apartment, staring across the lake, her voice low, tired, afraid. Anakin arguing with someone unseen, and beneath it all, another presence. Watching, listening, guiding. Malorum's breath slowed. He knew that presence. He had always known Sidious. The Emperor had been here, not just as Chancellor, as something darker, something patient. Padme hadn't died because she was weak. She had died because she knew too much, because she stood too close to the truth of what Anakin had become, and what Palpatine had made him. The realization settled heavy and sharp. Sidious hadn't just ruled Naboo. He had fed on its beauty, its innocence, its silence. And Malorum had followed in his footsteps, used the same ground, touched the same dark. That was when he understood the trap. Naboo wasn't refuge. It was exposure. If Olin found him here, the truth would surface. Not about Padme alone, but about Malorum, about the rituals, about the betrayal that had already begun. He shut down the recorder and stood very still. Above him, the palace lights shimmered across the water. Below him, the chamber waited. And somewhere between memory and reality, Malorum felt the hunt close in. This was where it began. And now, whether he wanted it or not, this was where it would end. Padme Amidala had never been naive. That was the lie history told to make her death easier to accept. That she was too gentle for the darkness around her, too hopeful, too human. Malorum knew better. The chamber beneath the palace did not show lies. It showed fragments, moments left behind when emotions burned deep enough to stain stone. He activated the recorder again, slower this time, letting it pull from residual echoes, not forcing anything to surface. The Sith had learned long ago that truth resisted pressure. It emerged only when invited. The images returned. Padme walking through the halls of Theed at night, alone. Guards dismissed. Lights dimmed. Her face calm, but her mind restless. She had known Anakin was changing. Not in the dramatic way others imagined. Not rage or cruelty. Withdrawal. Silence. Secrets that settled between them like fog. She spoke to Bail Organa in hushed tones, to Mon Mothma, to others who would later become rebels, though they did not yet know the name. She questioned emergency powers, questioned clone deployments, questioned the speed at which democracy was surrendering itself, and she questioned Palpatine, not openly, but often. The echo shifted. Padme stood before a tall figure in shadow, not in the Senate, not in public, here, on Naboo. Malorum felt his jaw tighten. Sidious had met her privately, not as emperor, as mentor, as protector. He told her the Republic was fragile, that the Jedi were reckless, that Anakin was under pressure only he could understand, that the future required sacrifice. Padme listened, and she did not agree. The echo fractured as emotions spiked. Fear, not for herself, for Anakin. She had seen flashes of what he was becoming. The anger he hid, the desperation, the way Palpatine's words wrapped around him, shaping his doubts. She realized then that the war was not about separatists or Jedi. It was about possession, and Anakin was being claimed. Malorum's hands curled slowly at his sides. Padme had not died of grief. She had died of resistance. Not a physical one, a refusal. Sidious had not struck her down. That would have drawn questions. Instead, he did what he did best. He listened, he waited, and he took what she loved most. The echo showed Anakin kneeling beside her, panic breaking through the armor already forming around his soul, his hands trembling, his breath shallow. She tried to speak, to warn him, but the words would not come. Not because she was weak, because something was holding them back. The Force itself, bent and twisted, suppressing her voice. Malorum felt cold spread through his chest. This was the truth buried beneath decades of lies. Padme had tried to save Anakin, and Sidious had silenced her, not with violence, with inevitability. The recorder dimmed. The chamber fell quiet. Malorum stood alone, staring at stone that had witnessed the birth of the Empire's greatest crime. He understood now why Sidious had chosen Naboo, why he had hidden rituals here, why this place mattered. Naboo was where hope had been gently suffocated, and Malorum had returned to breathe the same air. Above him, the palace stood untouched, beautiful, ignorant. Below him, the truth waited. And somewhere on the surface, Ferrus Olin was closing in. Because this truth could not remain buried forever. Not now. Not when Malorum finally understood what ambition truly cost. It began with silence. Not the comforting kind Malorum preferred, but the silence that follows after a name is spoken. And someone doesn't deny it. His name had reached the ears of those who remembered Jedi faces, who tracked strange disappearances, who watched patterns inside the Empire, not from loyalty, but from fear. Ferrus Olin was one of them. A name Malorum once thought had vanished with the Order, but the Force had a cruel sense of timing. Olin did not return with vengeance. He returned with quiet eyes. He returned as a shadow inside the system, not against it. He walked the corridors of worlds the Empire thought secure. He asked questions no one had the courage to answer. He listened more than he spoke. And wherever he went, things began to unravel. Malorum felt it first on Coruscant, a delay in communication, a missing informant, a senator who no longer returned his messages. But it was on Naboo that the silence turned to motion. Ferrus had come, not with stormtroopers, not with weapons, but with knowledge. He knew what Malorum had been doing, not everything, not the rituals or the names beneath the palace, but the children, the disappearances, the falsified records. He had pieced together enough to make others listen. And the danger wasn't just exposure. It was proof. Proof that Malorum's mask, the one he had worn so carefully across each role, each lie, each command, was slipping. The Empire was not kind to mistakes, especially ones that revealed forbidden ambitions. The Sith were meant to be unseen. Only two. Always two. Malorum's hunger had broken that law in silence. But now, the silence was breaking him. He moved his base from the hidden chamber to an old villa along the lake, once belonging to a noble family, lost during the Clone Wars. He thought the isolation would help. It didn't. He began seeing movements in reflections, not in the Force, but in windows, in water, in shadow. He destroyed 3 mirrors in a single night. He changed his routines daily. He no longer trusted his own voice on recordings. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. Ferrus was getting closer, and not just him. Bail Organa had sent a probe to Naboo's royal security. One of the Queen's advisors had begun asking questions. There were rumors in the lower city of black-robed figures moving at night. Malorum had once believed he could control the narrative. Now he was the subject of it, the hunted. He never saw Olin directly, only the aftermath. A datapad missing from a sealed archive, a coded message intercepted but too late, a servant's eyes that lingered a second too long. And yet, Malorum did not flee. He should have. But part of him wanted Olin to come, wanted someone to see, because the power he had gathered meant nothing in the dark. The rituals, the names, the blood-soaked fragments of ancient Sith secrets. They had given him knowledge, but not peace. And now, the cost had come due. Ferrus Olin was not a warrior anymore. He was a witness, and Malorum's last secret would not survive him. The end didn't come with a battle. It came with footsteps, one set, measured, calm, inevitable. Malorum stood in the underground chamber beneath the villa, watching the lake through a slit of glass carved into stone. The surface above was calm, still, like nothing beneath it had ever bled. But it had. He had buried pieces of himself here. Secrets drawn from Sith rituals, stolen from old scrolls, fragments of power whispered by spirits he could not name. The room still echoed with the last chant he had spoken, but nothing had answered. Not the Force, not the darkness, not even the ghost of Sidious. He turned as the stone door slid open. Ferrus Olin did not draw a weapon. He didn't have to. His presence said more than any blade. "You don't have to run," Ferrus said quietly. Malorum smiled, thin and bitter. The silence between them felt heavier than the walls. Ferrus stepped forward. "Why here?" Malorum didn't answer. He didn't need to. Padme Amidala had been the seed of too many things. The rebellion, the fall of the Chosen One, the Empire itself. And Malorum had tried to understand her the only way he knew how, by consuming everything she left behind. He looked at Ferris and saw the kind of Jedi who should have died with the others. One who carried guilt like armor. One who didn't speak in absolutes because he no longer believed in any. "You don't understand what's coming," Malorum said. Ferris didn't flinch. Malorum moved first, not to kill, but to destroy what he couldn't have. The old panel hidden behind the stone altar was never meant to survive him. It was wired to the villa's foundation, and he pressed it without hesitation. A tremor shook the floor. Above them, the lake rippled. Below, heat began to rise from the cracked vents. Ferris surged forward, but it was too late. Malorum backed away slowly. He said. Flames erupted along the outer walls. The Sith markings he had drawn in blood began to melt. The chamber itself groaned under the weight of its betrayal. Ferris reached him, not with violence, but with pity. That was the final wound. Malorum struck, wild and wordless, but Ferris caught his arm and twisted it away. No blade, no force lightning, just hands. And then silence again. When the fire reached the central pillar, Malorum staggered. The stone above them cracked. Water poured through in streams, turning smoke into steam. Ferris didn't flee. He lifted Malorum by the collar, dragging him toward the rising stairway. Malorum struggled not from pain, from pride. He didn't want to be saved. Not like this, not by him. But the body weakens when the mind has burned too long. And so, for a moment, the Sith who had built an empire beneath another man's empire let himself be pulled toward the surface. The stairwell crumbled behind them. The lake caved in, and Naboo, silent and serene above, swallowed its last ghost. Malorum died before the sun rose. Not with a scream, not with a name, just a breath that never returned. Ferris left his body in the ruins. No grave, no monument, only the faint reflection of fire beneath the glassy lake, and the whisper of a lesson no one would admit, that even within the shadows of the Sith, some sought more than power. They sought understanding, and it destroyed them just the same. There is a silence the Empire never speaks of, not because it's unimportant, but because it's dangerous. They erased his name, not with blasters or fire, but with paperwork, with empty records, with faces that looked away. And in doing so, they buried a shadow so deeply that even the Force seemed to hesitate when searching for it. Malorum was never a Sith Lord, not officially, never a commander, never a ranking officer. He was something worse, something in between, an agent of darkness with no nameplate, no uniform, no legacy. And yet, in the quiet corridors of the imperial bureaucracy, he had moved like a virus. There were whispers among clerks on Coruscant who remembered odd assignments, orders with no origin, death certificates rewritten, Jedi marked as captured, only to vanish forever. They didn't know his name, but they remembered his presence. A man with a voice too calm, a smile too still, and questions that never made sense until it was far too late. Some said he had been there the day the archives were sealed, that he watched the Jedi Temple burn not as a soldier, but as something else, a collector, a witness, perhaps even a student. The guards who remembered him were reassigned or silenced. No one ever confirmed he existed, but silence is not the same as forgetting. In the lower levels of Coruscant, where truth becomes myth and myth becomes warning, His name survives in fragments. These weren't titles, they were warnings, passed from mouth to mouth like old war stories, the kind you didn't share unless you wanted someone to come knocking. Some scavengers found a datapad years later, melted, scorched, buried beneath rubble near the old Senate housing quarters. It had a single entry still functional. No name, just a list, Jedi names. None of them were children. He hadn't been hunting Padawans. He had been studying something else, something deeper. Some even say he was more interested in who the Jedi were than what they could do, their bloodlines, their failures, their secrets. One witness, an ex-Republic analyst who defected after the Clone Wars, claimed she saw Malorum reviewing ancient Jedi genealogy. She said he was obsessed with tracing the lineage of Force users, looking for patterns, looking for gaps. She died in an accident the same week she spoke those words. What kind of man hunts for the roots of power, not just the fruit? It was not enough for Malorum to destroy Jedi. He needed to understand them, not because he admired them, but because he feared what he didn't control. He feared the idea that some light still remained, buried in names, families, or places the Empire dared not touch. And so the Empire buried him. Officially, he never existed. The records of his work with the Imperial youth programs were sealed. His assignments under the Inquisitorius were scrubbed. Even Vader refused to speak his name, not out of loyalty, but perhaps out of contempt. He had operated outside their chains, a free agent of the dark, loyal only to a vision he never shared. When he vanished on Naboo, the reports were vague. Fire, sabotage, rebel interference, nothing conclusive, nothing traceable. His body was never recovered, and no funeral was held. For most Imperials, that was the end of it. But not for all. There are vaults on Obroa sky, beneath layers of clearance so deep even moths cannot enter. Inside are fragments of operations labeled Spectre Protocol. Handwritten notes, redacted communiques, analysis reports with large black marks covering entire pages. All of them lead to one conclusion. Someone inside the Empire believed Malorum knew too much. Not just about Jedi, not just about Sith, but about something worse. Something hidden beneath the surface of galactic history. A truth too sharp for the Empire's lie to survive beside it. And so he was buried, not in soil, not in stone, but in silence. Yet even silence decays, and beneath the dust, the shadow still lingers, waiting. The Inquisitorius never feared rebels. They feared something else. They were trained to hunt Jedi, to erase the light that once defined the galaxy. But even among their own, there were things they would not speak of. Not out of respect, out of fear. Malorum was not one of them. He never wore their armor. He never stood beside Vader in battle. But he moved through their halls. He watched their trials. And he asked questions that no Inquisitor wanted to answer. What was left of a Jedi after the breaking? Could you burn out the light and still leave a mind behind? He asked it calmly, like someone curious about the weather. But those who heard him never forgot the way his eyes lingered, as if he wasn't wondering, as if he already knew. The 12th sister once claimed he watched a full interrogation without blinking. Not once. She said he stood in the corner as the Jedi screamed, not to enjoy it, not even to study it, just to listen, as if the words meant more to him than the pain itself. She stopped speaking his name after that. Some believed he was sent by Sidious to monitor them. Others whispered that he was a failed apprentice, a shadow that had never been claimed. There were even rumors that he had once tried to join the Inquisitors and was denied. But he kept coming back, kept watching, kept learning. One Inquisitor vanished after questioning him, not during a mission, not in combat. Just gone. Her gear left behind. Her name removed from the roster. The others got the message. He wasn't one of them, but he was above them, and that terrified them more than they ever admitted. Because Malorum didn't wield a saber. He wielded knowledge. And the Empire was built on secrets. He knew who the Inquisitors used to be, knew their Jedi names, knew which ones broke quickly and which ones didn't break at all. And he remembered, even when they wanted to forget. No name, no image, just a description monitors spiritual integrity of repurposed assets. That description matches only one man. He had the power to stop an execution, or order one. But that wasn't power to him. That was just access. Real power was in what people buried. One of the last surviving clones from the Purge era, CT-2449, retired and hiding in the Outer Rim, claimed he saw Malorum reviewing old temple recordings, not for surveillance, for ceremony. He said the man was trying to reconstruct rituals, ones even the Jedi had forgotten. When asked why, the clone just shook his head. He wasn't trying to remember, he said. The Inquisitors didn't understand it. They weren't meant to. They were tools, hammers built to smash what was left of the old galaxy. But Malorum was something else. He was a knife, quiet, hidden, precise. He didn't need to lead. He just needed to survive long enough for the others to fall. And if they didn't fall, he'd help them. There's no record of when the Inquisitorius turned against him, but it happened, slowly, quietly, like rot behind a wall. Assignments were pulled, access was revoked, files disappeared. One by one the halls began to close to him, but not completely, because even then, even stripped of position and name, he still knew things. He still had leverage, and he used it. Somehow, he secured a final mission, not through Vader, not through Sidious, through channels no one has ever fully traced. It led him back to Naboo, back to where all of this began. The Inquisitors didn't follow, not because they couldn't, because they didn't want to know what he was looking for, because sometimes silence is safer than truth. And in the heart of the Empire, that silence screamed. It begins with dust. Buried beneath 1,000 meters of reinforced durasteel, in vaults designed to survive planetary bombardment, there are rooms where light hasn't touched the floor in decades. Rooms the Empire forgot, or pretended to forget. But something always remembers. Malorum's name appears in only 2 Imperial records that survived the fall of Coruscant. Not in personnel files, not in mission briefings, in audit logs, redacted, but visible, barely. A trace signature from a data slice conducted 17 years after the Clone Wars ended, cross-referenced against locked files from the Jedi Temple ruins. A ghost moving through a graveyard. No one was meant to find it. And yet, someone did. A Rebellion-era slicer named Velis uncovered the logs while searching for data on Project Harvester. He thought it was another Inquisitor, maybe an early prototype. But the more he looked, the more the name repeated. A name without a file, without a face, just a presence, like something the archives wanted to delete, but couldn't. And the more he searched, the worse it got. Security footage with corrupted metadata, holologs missing timestamps, rooms clearly entered, but no entry recorded. Files accessed but never opened, as if the vault itself was trying to forget him. One record mentioned Naboo. Velis stopped looking after that. He left a note on his data terminal. He wasn't working for the Empire. He was studying it. No one ever saw him again. There are other fragments, some so small they feel like dust in the air to too faint to touch, but too wrong to ignore. No logs of arrival, no logs of departure. But the ship's hyperdrive was active for less than an hour before vanishing from Imperial traffic nets entirely. No further detail, no follow-up, but the body was found with signs of force-based trauma, and in the lowest levels of the former Jedi Temple, now the Emperor's private sanctum. A broken recording device was found years later by New Republic recovery crews. The audio was corrupted. The voice didn't match Sidious or Vader, but the question was clear. It wasn't about a person. It was about knowledge, because that was what Malorum wanted more than anything. Not revenge, not rank, not glory. He wanted to know what the Jedi feared, what the Sith refused to teach, what the Emperor buried in vaults beneath the vaults. That was his obsession. That was his hunger. And the Empire could never fully erase it, because the Empire was built to hide things. But he was built to find them, and in the data fragments, the personnel lists, the corrupted footage, there's a pattern, a slow movement through the edges of power. He never stayed long, never made demands. He just watched, listened, collected. He entered the highest rooms with the lowest clearance, and no one stopped him, because no one wanted to admit he was there. Because the moment you saw him, he saw you. And once he saw you, you were part of it. Part of something no one wanted to name. There are whispers, denied but repeated, that he tried to steal from the Emperor's private holocron vault, that he broke through a security field keyed to Sidious's own life signature, that he stood in the room alone for 11 minutes, and when he left, 3 holocrons were missing. No alarms, no pursuit, no confirmation. Only the vault's inventory log, quietly revised the next day. 3 entries removed, not marked as stolen. That was the final fragment. Because after that, the data trail ends. No records, no sightings, no financial transfers, not even black market traces. It's as if he walked out of the story. But stories don't end. They just get buried. And the deeper you dig, the colder it gets. Because something is still there, not in the files, in the silence between them, waiting. The Empire believed it had finished the story, that once the name was erased, the threat would fade, that without records, without witnesses, without proof, Malorum would dissolve into rumor, and then into nothing at all. Empires always believe this. They mistake silence for absence. But shadows do not vanish when the light turns away. They change shape. They stretch. They wait. Years after Naboo, long after Sidious fell and Vader burned, there were still moments when old Imperials paused mid-sentence. When veterans of the Inquisitorius avoided certain topics, when archivists refused to open sealed vaults, even under New Republic authority, they never said why. They just said it was better not to know, because knowing had consequences. There are witnesses who swear they saw him after Naboo, not alive, not whole, but present. An unnamed figure in hollow footage recovered from a destroyed Imperial relay. The image is distorted, half-burned, but the posture is unmistakable. Hands folded, head tilted, watching. The timestamp is wrong. The system had been offline for weeks. Others speak of a voice, calm, measured, asking questions in places no one should have been able to access. A presence felt in abandoned Imperial academies where children once learned obedience instead of hope. They say the air grew heavy, that the silence felt familiar. No one ever confirms these stories, but no one laughs at them either. Because Malorum was never defined by flesh. He was defined by method, by patience, by the belief that power did not need to be displayed to be effective. And those beliefs outlived him. There are fragments of doctrine still circulating in Black Ops manuals. Training procedures without attribution. Psychological frameworks that strip identity before loyalty. Fear models refined beyond cruelty into something colder. No one admits where they came from, but they work. Some claim he left contingencies behind. Information caches meant to be found only when the Empire collapsed. Lessons for those who survived regimes not served them. Instructions written not in words, but in patterns. Disappear here. Erase this. Wait. The New Republic never fully uncovered his influence. They didn't know what to look for. They searched for leaders, for commanders, for Sith. Malorum had been none of those. He had been a question, and questions are harder to kill. Ferrus Olin never spoke publicly about Naboo, not in Senate hearings, not in memoirs, not even in private council sessions. When asked once, years later, he only said this: "Some men don't fall." And that was all. Padme Amidala's name was restored to honor. The truth of her death was debated, softened, obscured by politics and grief. But one detail was never recovered: the data Malorum had recorded beneath the palace. The recorder was never found. Neither was the archive he carried in memory, which means something else survived Naboo. Not a man, a record. And records have a way of resurfacing when the galaxy is least prepared. In the deep archives of the Force itself, there are echoes that do not fade, moments that resist erasure, lives that imprint not through greatness, but through precision. Malorum was one of those lives, not because he changed the fate of the galaxy, but because he understood it. He saw how empires rose by consuming truth, how they fell by choking on it, how silence was never neutral. And so, even now, long after the Empire's banners were torn down, there are places where history feels incomplete, where the past refuses to settle, where names are missing on purpose. In those places, the shadow still breathes, not loudly, not defiantly, but patiently, waiting for someone curious enough to dig and foolish enough to listen. He had always believed the answers were hidden in the past, not in the temples, not in the Force, but in what others forgot, what others feared to remember. Long before he called himself a Sith, long before he even understood what the dark side truly was, Malorum knew that knowledge was power, and power was always buried. The Jedi taught restraint. They buried what they deemed unworthy. The Sith? They destroyed what they couldn't control. But Malorum, he collected. He waited. He watched. Even as a young student of the Inquisitorius, he asked questions others didn't dare whisper. He had seen the files, the redacted missions, the incomplete reports. He noticed the patterns, Jedi masters who had vanished long before Order 66, temples sealed by Republic decree, entire regions of the unknowns quietly marked as restricted by the Senate. It didn't make sense. Not to him, not to the boy who had grown up in silence, orphaned by war, and raised by shadows. When he was still only a candidate for the Inquisitorius, he had spent weeks breaking into the sealed wings of the Jedi archives. He would sit there, hours at a time, in total silence, staring at broken star maps, forgotten names, erased lineages. He knew he was not supposed to be there. He knew Sidious would kill him if he found out. But that never stopped him. Not once. There was something in the archives that spoke to him, not a voice, not a vision, a pull, like gravity made of memory. A feeling that if he could just open the right file, just unlock the right holocron, he would understand everything. He could feel the weight of history pressing against the room. Centuries of war, betrayal, resurrection, all hidden in dust. It was in one of those late nights that he first found the fragment. A corrupted file, buried under layers of obsolete indexing, misfiled in a chamber the Jedi hadn't accessed in decades. No name, no origin. It meant nothing to him at first, but it haunted him. He memorized it, spoke it in his sleep. He started tracing similar references, found them in old Sith manuscripts, in footnotes of Jedi reports, in the margins of forbidden translations. Over time, he realized it was not a name. It was a warning. Sidious had once told him the archives were a dead end, that all that mattered now was control of systems, of armies, of fear. But Malorum didn't believe that. Sidious ruled the present. Malorum wanted the past. He wanted to understand what came before Darth Bane, before the rule of two, before Korriban itself. He started mapping timelines no one had connected, splicing Sith prophecy with Jedi vision, tracking ancient bloodlines and broken oaths. He realized there were Sith lords who had never been logged, Jedi masters who had vanished just before major galactic shifts. He started to believe there were other players, other shadows, ones that Sidious never mentioned. Perhaps ones even Sidious didn't know existed. He wasn't interested in lightsaber forms. He didn't train for battle. He trained his memory, his obsession. He didn't want to be a warlord. He wanted to be the only one who understood how the galaxy actually worked. But knowledge, like the Force, comes at a cost. And the more he uncovered, the more he began to break. The archives had rules, patterns, files that obeyed logic. But some of the things he found didn't make sense. Recordings that looped into themselves. Hollow entries dated centuries before their creators were born. Visions from Jedi masters that described events that hadn't happened yet, but did happen later. He began to suspect the Force wasn't a line. That time wasn't a river. That maybe, just maybe, someone or something was folding it. He didn't tell Sidious. He didn't tell the Inquisitors. He told no one. Because deep down, Malorum knew if the Sith had missed something this big, they would kill to keep it hidden, even from each other. And so he returned to the archives again and again, each visit shorter, each exit more frantic. He slept less, spoke less, ate less. The archives were supposed to answer him, but they never did. They only gave him more questions. And so he kept digging, even when the lights flickered, even when the holocrons began responding without being touched, even when the Force itself began to whisper back. Because for Darth Malorum, the archives were never enough. It began with a name, then a whisper, then silence long after his body left the archives. His mind never did. The visions came slowly at first, strange images during meditation, moments of disconnection, feelings that didn't belong to him. At first, he thought they were dreams, glitches in the Force. But over time, they became something more, something louder, more persistent. He stopped trusting his own reflection. Sometimes it looked back too late. Sometimes it didn't move at all. One night, he collapsed in the chamber beneath the Theed Palace. His lungs froze mid-breath. His heart slowed. For 17 seconds he saw the galaxy split open, and something step through. Not a figure, not a shape, just a presence. Cold, towering, eternal. It looked at him without eyes, and for the first time since he was a child, Malorum felt afraid. He woke up with blood in his mouth. The Force had shown him things he couldn't explain, not power, not destiny, but echoes, like aftershocks of forgotten moments, Jedi temples swallowed by time, Sith tombs that had never been opened, yet remembered him. Civilizations that spoke languages he understood without learning them. He became convinced the Force was trying to tell him something, not in words, not in logic, in fragments, feelings, keys to doors that no longer existed. He started recording everything, scribbled notes in his own blood, diagrams no one else could read. He began to speak to the Force like it was alive, like it was watching him, and it was. In one vision, he stood before a tree made of light. Its roots reached into worlds he couldn't name. Its branches burned like suns. Hanging from the limbs were Jedi, silent, still, broken. In the center, a child. Eyes open, no mouth, no name. But when it looked at him, Malorum collapsed again. That's when the fear turned to madness. He stopped reporting to Sidious. He avoided the Inquisitorius altogether. His missions were fabricated, his identities false. He moved from sector to sector, chasing rumors no one else believed in. Force anomalies, temple awakenings, children who spoke languages older than the Republic. He didn't want to control the galaxy anymore. He wanted to understand why it was shaped this way, who had shaped it, and whether that shaping had ended or was still happening. Sometimes he would sit alone in the dark and speak aloud. But the visions didn't stop. In time, they began speaking to him. Once, on a dead world near the Maw, he entered a ruin that didn't appear on any map. There were no carvings, no doors, just stone and cold. But in the center, there was a chair, and on the chair, his own body, aged and silent. He ran. The memory followed him. He began to believe he was seeing through time, that the Force was collapsing around him, that threads of fate had snapped, and he was falling between them. He wrote in ancient tongues, started losing time. Days disappeared. Voices echoed behind walls that weren't there. He began building a map, not of planets, not of star systems, but of echoes, places where the Force twisted unnaturally, places where Sith and Jedi had vanished without explanation. They pulsed on his map like scars. At the center of the map was something he didn't recognize, a spiral. It changed every time he looked at it, but it never moved. He stopped sleeping. He feared that if he closed his eyes for too long, he'd wake up somewhere else. And then it happened. He opened his eyes one day and didn't know where he was. He looked at his hands and didn't recognize them. He spoke, and the voice that came out didn't feel like his own. He was still Malorum, but something else had taken root inside. The Force was no longer answering him. It was listening, and he realized too late. He had been asking the wrong questions all along. He didn't want power. He wanted understanding. But the dark side doesn't give understanding. It only gives hunger. And now, it was his turn to be devoured. Sidious had never called him apprentice. That alone should have been warning enough. Malorum existed in the space between titles, too useful to discard, too dangerous to claim. He was trained, tested, sharpened, but never crowned, never given a place in the lineage. The rule of two loomed over everything, and Malorum was never meant to stand within it. He was meant to circle it. At first he accepted this. Power, after all, did not require ceremony. He believed proximity was enough, that by watching Sidious closely, by studying Vader's failures, by listening instead of striking, he would inherit something greater than a throne. But inheritance implies permission, and Malorum was never given that. Sidious spoke to him rarely. When he did, it was never about the past, never about prophecy, never about meaning, only results, only control, only the present moment, endlessly repeated. Malorum realized then that the Emperor feared the future, not defeat, understanding. Sidious did not want to know why the galaxy turned as it did. He wanted it to turn because he commanded it. He had no interest in echoes, or wounds, or patterns that stretched beyond his grasp. He dismissed Malorum's questions with cold amusement. Malorum bowed, but inside, something cracked. He was not learning anymore. He was being contained. The Inquisitors obeyed him, but they did not respect him. Vader tolerated him, but never trusted him. And Sidious watched him the way one watches a storm cloud, not with fear, but calculation. Malorum began to understand his role. He was a fail-safe, a tool to be used and erased. That realization did not break him. It freed him. If he was not an apprentice, then he owed no loyalty, no obedience beyond survival, no silence beyond necessity. He stopped seeking approval, stopped reporting discoveries, stopped sharing visions. He became careful, precise. He built distance between himself and the throne. But distance comes with isolation. There were nights he stood alone in sealed chambers, listening to the hum of Coruscant beneath his feet, wondering if anyone would notice if he vanished. He imagined Sidious's reaction, Vader's, the Inquisitors. None of them would mourn. That truth hollowed him out. He began training alone, not in combat, but in endurance. Meditation sessions that lasted days. Exercises designed to strip away identity. He tried to detach himself from ambition, from fear, from desire. But the dark side does not reward detachment. It punishes it. The visions intensified. His control weakened. He felt himself slipping between moments, losing track of where he ended and the Force began. He started to fear that without a master, without a chain to anchor him, he would dissolve entirely. That fear drove him back toward Sidious one final time. He requested an audience. Sidious listened and said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy, intentional. Malorum spoke of knowledge uncovered, of threats unseen, of forces older than the Sith. He offered what he had learned, hoping, foolishly, that it would matter. Sidious laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, amused. "You seek a master," the Emperor said. Malorum clenched his jaw. Sidious leaned forward, eyes burning with ancient contempt. "You are not becoming anything," he said. That was the moment Malorum understood. There would be no ascension, no inheritance, no place for him in the future the Sith were building. He left the chamber without permission, without acknowledgement, without looking back. From that moment on, Malorum was alone. No master, no apprentice, no chain. Just a mind filled with knowledge it was never meant to carry. And a dark side that had no use for him anymore. In the end, it wasn't betrayal that destroyed him. It was scale. Darth Malorum did not fall because he reached for power too quickly. He fell because he reached too far, too wide, too deep. He tried to see the galaxy not as it was, but as it had ever been, and as it might one day become. The Force does not forgive that kind of curiosity. By the time he withdrew fully from Imperial space, Malorum was already unraveling. His thoughts no longer moved in straight lines. Memories overlapped. Names lost meaning. He could recall events that had not happened to him and forget moments he had lived through only days before. He knew this was happening. That awareness was his final strength. He sealed himself away from others, drifting between systems under false identities, avoiding contact, avoiding influence. He believed that isolation might slow the decay, that without new stimuli, the visions would fade. They did not. They grew clearer. He began to see the galaxy as layers, one atop another, past bleeding into present, futures collapsing into choice. He saw Jedi victories rot into Sith empires. He saw Sith triumphs hollow into ash. Every path ended the same way. Silence. The realization broke something essential in him. All his searching, all his study, all his sacrifices, they had not revealed a secret that could be used. They had revealed a pattern that could not be escaped. The galaxy did not need masters. It consumed them. Malorum tried to warn others, not Sidious, not Vader. They would never listen. Instead, he reached outward, toward scholars, archivists, defectors, those who still questioned the shape of things. But his warnings came out fractured, incomplete. He spoke of wounds and echoes, of cycles that fed on belief. They thought him mad. Perhaps he was. On Naboo, in the final days before his death, Malorum stopped running. He returned not to power, but to origin, to the place where the fall had truly begun, where love had been lost, where silence had first taken hold. He didn't go there to fight. He went there to understand. In the ruins beneath the palace, he recorded everything he could remember. Every vision, every pattern, every name that had slipped through the cracks of history. He knew he would not survive much longer. His mind was already fragmenting, but fragments could still be useful. Truth did not require completeness, only honesty. When Ferris Olin found him, Malorum did not resist. He looked tired, relieved. For the first time since childhood, the questions had stopped multiplying. The visions had slowed, not because the Force had released him, but because he had finally stopped chasing it. He understood then what the Sith never had. That knowledge without purpose becomes poison. That understanding without limits becomes isolation. That seeing everything means belonging nowhere. Malorum had wanted to stand outside the cycle, to observe it, to map it, to master it. Instead, he became one more casualty of it. Another mind broken by truths too large to carry alone. When he died, the Force did not tremble. The galaxy did not change. Empires rose and fell as they always had. But somewhere deep beneath the noise of history, a silence settled, not empty, not peaceful, just final. Darth Malorum was erased not because he was dangerous, but because he was inconvenient. He did not fit the story the Sith needed. He did not fit the victory the Jedi imagined. He had seen too much to serve either. And so, his name was buried. His work scattered, his warnings ignored. But the patterns he saw remain. The wounds still ache. The cycle still turns. And every so often, when someone digs too deep into the past, when they look for answers that promise understanding instead of control, they feel it, that pressure, that pull, that whisper telling them to stop. Because once there was a Sith who tried to see everything, and the dark side devoured him for it.